Sir, please take my children. The starving mother whispered. The rich cowboy said, I'll take you too. When a desperate mother collapsed on a wealthy rancher's doorstep, begging him to save her children, she expected charity, not love. What happened next shocked an entire town and proved that family isn't always born from blood. This is the story of a knock in the rain that changed everything. Stay until the end to see how their impossible love survived. And comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The storm came like a living thing, hungry and violent, tearing across the Texas high plains with a fury that seemed almost personal. Lightning split the black sky into jagged pieces, illuminating the endless grassland in brief, ghostly flashes before plunging it back into darkness. Thunder rolled across the earth like cannon fire, shaking the very bones of the land. Inside the Calder ranch house, Graham Calder sat alone in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk before him. The fireplace crackled softly, but its warmth couldn't reach the cold that had settled into his chest 3 years ago, the day he'd buried his wife Sarah and their infant son in the hard Texas ground. He was a man who had everything and nothing. At 34, he owned 12,000 acres of prime grazing land, 2,000 head of cattle, and more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. His hands were calloused from honest work, his reputation solid as oak. But the house around him echoed with emptiness, each room a monument to loss. Graham ran his fingers through his dark hair, streaked prematurely with silver at the temples. His blue eyes, once bright with ambition and joy, had grown distant, like windows in an abandoned house. He'd stopped seeing the point of most things. The ranch ran itself through the competence of his foreman. The money accumulated in bank accounts he rarely checked. He existed, but he'd stopped living the day he'd lowered those 2 coffins into the earth. The wind shrieked around the house like a banshee, rattling the windows in their frames. Rain hammered against the walls with the force of thrown gravel. It was the kind of night that made a man grateful for 4 walls and a roof, the kind that kept sensible people locked safe in their homes, which was why the knocking, when it came, seemed impossible. At first, Graham thought he'd imagined it, a trick of the wind, a branch blown against the door. But then it came again, desperate and insistent. 3 sharp raps, a pause, then 3 more. Someone was out there, in this storm, at this hour. He rose from his chair, moving through the darkened hallway with the caution of a man who'd learned young that nothing good came calling after midnight. His hand instinctively checked the revolver at his hip, a habit from years when Texas was wilder than it was now. The knocking came again, weaker this time, almost pleading. Graham threw back the heavy bolt and pulled open the door. The storm tried to tear it from his hands, wind and rain exploding into the entryway with brutal force, but Graham barely noticed. His attention had fixed completely on the apparition standing on his porch. A woman, thin as a whisper, soaked to the bone, her dress, once perhaps a decent calico, now hanging in tatters that clung to a frame so skeletal it hurt to look at. Her hair, dark and matted, was plastered to a face that was all sharp angles and hollow shadows. But her eyes, God, her eyes, burned with a desperate fading light that struck something deep in Graham's chest. In her arms, wrapped in a scrap of blanket that was more holes than fabric, was an infant. Around her skirts clung 3 other children, their faces pinched with cold and hunger and a terror so profound it seemed to have stolen their voices. The woman swayed on her feet, and Graham realized with a jolt that she was barely conscious, held upright only by some terrible reserve of will. Her lips, cracked and bleeding, moved. He had to lean forward to hear her voice above the storm. Sir, her voice was barely a whisper, rough as sandpaper. Sir, please, take my children. The words hit Graham like a physical blow. He'd heard desperate pleas before. This was hard country, and hard country made hard choices. But there was something in her voice, in those 4 simple words, that carried the weight of absolute surrender. This wasn't a woman asking for charity. This was a mother offering the last thing she had left to give. I'm dying, she continued, each word an obvious effort. I know it. I can feel it. But them? Her arms tightened fractionally around the infant. They got a chance. They're good children. They won't be trouble. They can work. The older ones, they're strong. They can... Her knees buckled. Graham moved without thinking, catching her before she hit the porch. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of sharp bones and fever-hot skin. The children cried out, their small hands reaching for their mother with desperate urgency. "Please," the woman whispered against his chest. "Please, just the children. You don't have to. I ain't asking you to. Just them. Please, God, just save them." Something ancient and long buried stirred in Graham's chest. He looked down at her face, ravaged by starvation and exposure, and the kind of grinding poverty that killed slowly and without mercy. Then he looked at the children. The oldest girl, perhaps 10, trying so hard to be brave. Twin boys, maybe 7. Their identical faces streaked with tears and mud. And the baby, barely old enough to have a personality, staring up at him with enormous eyes. He saw himself in those eyes. Saw the boy he'd been at 7 years old, standing over his own mother's grave, holding his little sister's hand while the Kansas wind howled around them. Saw the hunger, the fear, the terrible uncertainty of not knowing if tomorrow would bring food or death. He'd survived because a rancher named Abel Calder had seen a starving orphan and decided to take a chance, had given that boy a name, a home, a future, had taught him that mercy wasn't weakness, and that the strongest thing a man could do was choose kindness when the world expected cruelty. Graham Calder looked at this dying woman and her starving children, and he heard Abel's voice in his memory. "Sometimes, son, God puts people in your path, not because you can save them, but because saving them saves you too." "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos of the storm around them, "I'm not taking your children." The woman's eyes widened with despair so profound it was physically painful to witness. "I'm taking you too," Graham finished. For a moment she stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. Then something in her face crumbled, not with relief, but with a kind of disbelief so complete it was almost heartbreaking. You don't understand," she managed. "I can't pay. I got nothing. No money. No—" "I don't recall asking for payment," Graham interrupted gently. "Now, we can stand here in this storm debating your financial situation, or we can get you and these children inside before you all catch your death. What's it going to be?" The oldest girl spoke up then, her voice surprisingly firm despite her obvious terror. "Mama needs help, mister. She hasn't eaten in 6 days. She gave us everything." 6 days. The words settled into Graham's chest like stones. "What's your name, girl?" he asked. "Lydia, sir. Lydia Ward. These are my brothers Ben and Bo, and the baby is Ruth." She said it with a protective formality, as if establishing their identities might somehow make them more real, harder to dismiss. "Well, Miss Lydia Ward, your mama's right about one thing. She does need help, and so do you. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to carry your mother inside. You're going to follow me with your brothers and your sister. We're going to get everyone warm and dry and fed, and we're not going to discuss anything else until morning. Understood?" Lydia looked at her mother, who managed the smallest of nods. The girl straightened her thin shoulders. "Yes, sir." Graham scooped the woman into his arms, she really did weigh almost nothing, and turned toward the house. "Come on then, quickly now." They stumbled inside, the children clustering close to each other like frightened birds. Graham kicked the door shut behind them, cutting off the storm's roar to a muted howl. Water pooled on the hardwood floor from their soaked clothes and dripping hair. "Lydia," Graham said, his voice taking on the tone of a man used to giving orders that would be followed. "There's a door at the end of this hallway. That's the kitchen. You'll find towels in the cupboard next to the stove. Bring them here. Move quickly." The girl darted off without hesitation, and Graham was struck by how efficiently she moved despite her obvious exhaustion. A child who'd learned early to follow instructions without question. He carried the woman to the parlor, laying her carefully on the leather sofa nearest the fireplace. She'd lost consciousness during the short walk, her head lolling against his shoulder. Up close, he could see the fever spots burning in her cheeks, the way her breathing came too fast and too shallow. The twin boys stood frozen in the doorway, identical expressions of terror and hope warring on their young faces. The baby, Ruth, had begun to whimper, a weak, mewling sound that spoke of long hunger. "It's all right," Graham said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Your mama's going to be fine. She just needs rest and food and warmth, same as you. Lydia returned with an armful of towels, and Graham took them with a nod of approval. Good girl. Now, there's a bedroom upstairs, first door on the right. The bed's made. Can you take your brothers and sister up there, get them out of those wet clothes? What about Mama? Lydia's voice trembled for the first time. Your Mama's going to stay down here by the fire where I can watch her. I promise you, Miss Lydia, I'm going to take care of her, but I need you to take care of your brothers and sister right now. Can you do that for me? The girl's jaw set with determination that seemed far too old for her face. Yes, sir. There are quilts in the chest at the foot of the bed. Wrap everyone up warm. I'll bring food as soon as I can. Lydia gathered her brothers with practiced efficiency, and Graham watched as she herded them toward the stairs, Ruth still clutched in her arms. The little boys kept looking back at their mother with frightened eyes, but they went without protest. Alone with the unconscious woman, Graham moved quickly. He built up the fire until it roared in the fireplace, filling the room with heat and light. He fetched blankets from the linen closet, stripping away the woman's soaked dress with clinical detachment. This was about survival, not propriety, and replacing it with one of Sarah's old nightgowns. The clothes hung on the woman's skeletal frame like a sail with no wind. He wrapped her in layers of wool blankets, tucking them around her shivering body. Her skin was burning hot and ice cold at the same time, and her breathing had taken on a rattling quality that Graham recognized from too many nights sitting beside dying cattle during harsh winters. She was in a bad way, worse than bad. Without intervention, she'd likely be dead by morning. Graham stood, his mind already moving through the necessary steps. Food first, but carefully. Their stomachs would have shrunk. Too much too fast would make them sick. Broth, bread, maybe some milk warmed and cut with water. Then he'd need to monitor the woman's fever, try to get fluids into her somehow. Tomorrow, if she survived the night, he'd ride to town for Doc Matthews. He moved to the kitchen with the purposeful stride of a man who'd made a decision and wouldn't waste time second-guessing it. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the house, something had shifted. The silence that had pressed down on these rooms for 3 years had been broken by the sound of children's footsteps overhead, the muffled whisper of young voices, the soft crying of a baby. The house, Graham realized, was breathing again. He put coffee on to boil and started heating beef broth he'd made earlier in the week. While the broth warmed, he sliced bread and found butter, cheese, a jar of preserved peaches. Nothing fancy, but good solid food, the kind that stuck to ribs and gave strength. A small sound made him turn. Lydia stood in the kitchen doorway, still wrapped in a towel, her wet dress clinging to her thin frame. She watched him with the wary, calculating gaze of a child who'd learned the hard way that adult kindness often came with strings attached. "The boys are in bed," she reported. "Ruth stopped crying. I think she's too tired to cry anymore." "And you? Why aren't you getting warm?" Lydia's chin lifted slightly. "I wanted to make sure you were really going to feed us. Sometimes people say things but don't mean them." The statement, delivered with such matter-of-fact resignation, hit Graham harder than any accusation could have. This child had learned not to trust adult promises. How many times had she been disappointed? How many doors had been slammed in her face? "I mean it," Graham said quietly. He gestured to the table. "Sit down, Miss Lydia. You and I need to have a conversation." She moved to the chair with visible reluctance, perching on its edge as if ready to bolt. Graham poured her a cup of milk, warmed and sweetened with honey, and placed it in front of her along with a thick slice of buttered bread. "Eat," he commanded gently. Lydia stared at the food as if it might disappear. Her hands trembled as she reached for the bread, and when she took the first bite, tears began streaming down her face. She ate and cried simultaneously, trying to muffle the sobs even as she devoured the food with desperate hunger. Graham turned away, giving her privacy, busying himself with preparing a tray. His own throat felt tight. How long had it been since these children had eaten properly? How many nights had they gone to bed with empty bellies and hollow eyes? "Your mother," he said, keeping his tone conversational. "What's her name?" "Elena," Lydia managed between bites. "Elena Ward. She was married to James Ward, but he died 8 months ago. Cholera outbreak in Sweetwater." "I'm sorry, that's a hard thing." It got harder after. Lydia continued, and Graham heard the exhaustion in her young voice. Papa had debts. Men came and took everything. The house, the wagon, even Mama's wedding ring. Said it was owed. We ended up in a boarding house, but Mama couldn't make enough money to pay rent. The lady who ran it, she was nice at first, but then the girl's voice trailed off. Then what? Lydia's eyes met his, and Graham saw a knowledge there that no 10-year-old should possess. Then men started looking at Mama different, saying things, offering her money if she'd do things. Mama said no, and the boarding house lady got angry, told us to leave. That was 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. Living on the streets, or worse, in the wilderness, with 4 children and no resources. Graham felt rage kindle in his chest, hot and bright. Not at the girl, not even at the mother, but at a world that could be so casually cruel. We tried to walk to the next town, Lydia continued. Mama thought maybe her sister lived there, but when we got there, we found out Aunt Mary had died 2 years back. We didn't have money for food. Mama kept saying we'd be fine, that something would turn up, but I could see her getting weaker. She stopped eating 5 days ago, gave everything to us. And tonight, how did you end up here? The storm came and we were trying to find shelter. We saw your light. Mama didn't want to knock. She said bothering folk was wrong, but Ruth was crying so hard, and Ben and Bo were so cold. I told Mama we had to try, so we walked up to your door. Graham nodded slowly. He ladled broth into bowls, arranged everything on a tray with careful precision. Your mother's a brave woman, Miss Lydia, and you're a brave girl, but you don't have to be brave alone anymore. Not tonight. Lydia's eyes filled with fresh tears. You promise? You really promise you'll help us? Graham set down the tray and crouched in front of her, meeting her eyes directly. I promise. And I need you to understand something. When I make a promise, I keep it. Every time. No exceptions. Your mama and your brothers and your sister are safe here, and so are you. Something in the girl's face finally broke. She threw her arms around Graham's neck and sobbed, real deep sobs that shook her whole thin body. Graham held her awkwardly at first, then more firmly, one hand patting her back the way he remembered Abel Calder doing when Graham himself had been a frightened, grieving child. It's all right, he murmured. Let it out. You've been strong for so long. Let someone else be strong for a while. They stayed like that for several minutes, the girl crying out weeks of terror and exhaustion while the storm hammered against the windows. Finally, Lydia pulled back, wiping her eyes with her towel. I'm sorry, she whispered. I shouldn't have. Don't apologize for being human, Graham said firmly. Now, dry yourself off properly, then take this tray upstairs. Make sure your brothers eat slowly, small bites. Understand? Too much too fast will make them sick. There's milk for the baby in the bottle there. Then everyone sleeps. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest. Lydia nodded, taking the tray with careful hands. At the doorway she paused and looked back. Sir, what's your name? Graham. Graham Calder. Thank you, Mr. Calder, for everything. After she left, Graham prepared another tray and carried it to the parlor. Elena hadn't moved, but her breathing seemed slightly less labored. He sat in the chair beside the sofa and began the slow, patient work of trying to get liquid into her. A spoonful of broth at a time, waiting for her to swallow reflexively, then another spoonful. It was tedious work, and there was no guarantee it would be enough. But Graham had learned long ago that ranching, and life, was mostly about doing tedious, necessary work without guarantee of success. You did what needed doing because it needed doing, and you didn't stop until it was done. Outside, the storm began to ease. The thunder grew more distant, the rain softening from a hammer blow to a steady drumbeat. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and somewhere overhead, Graham heard the creak of bed springs as children settled into actual beds, perhaps for the first time in weeks. Elena stirred slightly, her fever-bright eyes opening just a crack. She looked at Graham with confusion, then slowly, recognition and memory returned. Her hand moved weakly toward him. My children, she whispered. Where are? Upstairs, safe, fed, sleeping in warm beds, Graham assured her quietly. Just like you're going to be once you get some of this broth in you. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes. You really took us in. I did. Why? The question was genuine, bewildered. You don't know us. We're nothing to you. Graham was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer. He could have said something simple and kind, something meaningless about Christian charity or basic human decency. But this woman had walked through hell for her children. She deserved truth. When I was 7 years old, he said slowly, my mother died, left me and my baby sister alone in the world. We were starving, desperate. A man named Abel Calder found us trying to steal eggs from his chicken coop. He could have had us arrested, beaten, run off his land. Instead, he took us home, fed us, gave us a place, eventually adopted us both, gave us his name. Everything I have, everything I am, exists because one man looked at 2 starving orphans and decided their lives mattered. Elena listened, her eyes never leaving his face. So when you ask me why, Graham continued, I'll tell you. Because I've been where your children are. I felt that hunger, that fear, that terrible certainty that the world doesn't care if you live or die. And I swore on Abel's grave, I swore that if I ever had the chance to be for someone else what he was for me, I wouldn't turn away. He paused. So, no, ma'am, you're not nothing to me. You're everything that matters. Fresh tears rolled down Elena's gaunt cheeks. I don't know how to repay. Then don't try. Just get better. Let your children be children for a while. That's payment enough. He helped her take a few more spoonfuls of broth before exhaustion claimed her again. Graham covered her with an extra blanket and settled into the chair, prepared to keep watch through the night. He'd done this before, sat vigil over sick cattle, injured horses, dying friends. He knew the rhythm of it, the long quiet hours broken by periodic checks, the way time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. But this felt different. For 3 years this house had been a tomb, every room a reminder of what he'd lost. He'd rattled around in it like a ghost, going through the motions of living without actually being alive. The silence had been oppressive, suffocating, driving him into darker and darker spaces inside his own head. Now, with 4 children sleeping upstairs and a dying woman breathing softly on his sofa, the house felt inhabited, real. The silence had been replaced with the small sounds of life, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of blankets, the soft snoring of exhausted children. Something in Graham's chest, something that had been clenched tight as a fist for 3 years, began to loosen. The night wore on. The storm passed, leaving behind the clean smell of rain-washed earth and the distant sound of water dripping from the eaves. Graham dozed in his chair, waking periodically to check Elena's breathing, to add wood to the fire, to listen for sounds from upstairs. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Graham stood stretching muscles stiff from hours in the chair and walked to the window. The world outside looked scrubbed clean, every color bright and sharp in the new light. The grassland stretched away to the horizon, dotted with his cattle, solid and real and thriving. He'd built this, created something from nothing, turned hard work and determination into prosperity. But what was prosperity worth if it sat empty and unused? What was the point of success if it benefited no one but himself? Behind him, Elena made a small sound. Graham turned to find her awake, her eyes clearer than they'd been the night before. The fever still burned in her, but the edge of it seemed less sharp. "Morning," he said quietly. "Morning," she replied, her voice still rough but stronger. "Your name?" "Lydia told me. Graham Calder." "That's right." "I need to tell you something, Mr. Calder." Elena struggled to sit up, and Graham moved to help her, propping pillows behind her back. "I won't be a burden. Soon as I'm strong enough, I'll work. I can cook, clean, sew. I'm good with accounts. And my children, they're hard workers, all of them. We'll earn our keep. I swear it." Graham pulled his chair closer and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Mrs. Ward, Elena, please." "Elena, then. I'm going to say this once, and I need you to hear it. You and your children are not employees. You're not servants. You're people who needed help, and I had help to give. That's the end of the transaction. But, however," he continued, holding up a hand, "if you want to help around the house because it makes you feel useful, I won't stop you. This place has been quiet since my wife died. Could use a woman's touch, if I'm being honest. But that's your choice, not an obligation. Clear? Elena stared at him with an expression Graham couldn't quite read. You're a strange man, Graham called her. So I've been told. A small sound from upstairs, a child's voice, quickly hushed, drew both their attention. Elena's face filled with such naked longing and relief that Graham had to look away. They really are all right? She asked. You're not just saying that? See for yourself. Graham stood and walked to the foot of the stairs. Miss Lydia, you and your brothers can come down now. Your mama's awake. The response was immediate. Thundering footsteps, a rush of small bodies down the stairs. The twins came first, identical whirlwinds of boy energy despite their ordeal, followed closely by Lydia carrying baby Ruth. They burst into the parlor and froze, staring at their mother as if she might disappear. Mama? Bo, or was it Ben, whispered. Come here, babies, Elena said, opening her arms. They descended on her like a storm, all talking at once, touching her face and hands as if to confirm she was real. Ruth, startled by the commotion, began to cry, and Elena took her, holding her close while the other children pressed against her sides. Graham retreated to the kitchen, giving them privacy. He started coffee brewing and began assembling breakfast. Eggs, bacon, biscuits, real food, the kind that would put meat on skinny bones and color in pale cheeks. As he worked, he could hear the murmur of voices from the parlor, punctuated by occasional laughter. Laughter. In his house, after 3 years of silence. Graham cracked eggs into a pan and realized he was smiling. An hour later, they were all gathered around the kitchen table, Elena wrapped in blankets in a chair Graham had carried in from the parlor, the children scrubbed clean and wearing a bizarre assortment of Graham's shirts as makeshift nightgowns. They ate with the focused intensity of the truly hungry, and Graham kept the food coming until even the bottomless pit of twin boys' stomachs seemed satisfied. Mr. Calder, Lydia said finally, setting down her fork with careful precision. What happens now? It was the question Graham had been expecting, the reasonable question, the practical question, and he didn't have a complete answer. Now, he said slowly, you stay here until your mama's well. That'll take time. A few weeks, maybe longer. Doc Matthews will come by tomorrow to check her over, make sure there's nothing seriously wrong besides exhaustion and starvation. And then? The girl's voice was steady, but Graham heard the fear underneath. He looked around the table at 4 pairs of eyes watching him with desperate hope. At Elena, trying so hard to stay upright despite obvious exhaustion. At these people who'd stumbled into his life on a storm-soaked night and somehow, in the space of 12 hours, made his house feel like a home again. Then, Graham said carefully, we figure out what comes next. Together. But I'll tell you this much. Nobody's going anywhere until they're ready. And maybe, he paused, choosing his words carefully, maybe not even then. This house is big. Too big for one man. Seems a waste, don't you think? Elena's eyes filled with tears. Again, or still, Graham wasn't sure. You can't mean... I mean exactly what I said. Now, these dishes won't wash themselves, and those children need proper clothes. We'll deal with logistics as they come. For today, let's just focus on today. Outside the kitchen window, the Texas sun climbed higher, burning off the last remnants of the storm. Graham's ranch stretched away in all directions, solid and prosperous and real. He'd built it with his own hands, carved success from hard ground and harder work. But as he looked around his kitchen, at children laughing over breakfast, at a woman slowly regaining strength, at the simple, chaotic beauty of a house full of life, Graham realized that everything he'd built had been leading to this moment, to this choice, to opening his door on a desperate night and saying yes to people who had nowhere else to go. He'd taken them in thinking he was saving them. He was beginning to suspect they might be saving him instead. The day unfolded with surprising ease. Graham rode to town and returned with Doc Matthews, a gruff man in his 60s who examined Elena with efficient thoroughness. His diagnosis was as Graham expected: severe malnutrition, exhaustion, and the lingering effects of exposure but nothing that rest and proper food couldn't fix. Keep her quiet for at least 2 weeks, Doc ordered, packing his bag. No heavy work, good food, plenty of water. She'll make a full recovery, but it'll take time. He paused at the door, his sharp eyes fixed on Graham. You know people will talk about this, don't you? A widow and her children living with a bachelor? Graham met his gaze steadily. Let them talk. Doc Matthews chuckled. You always were stubborn as a mule, Graham called her. I imagine that'll serve you well in the days ahead. He tipped his hat. Good luck, you're going to need it. After the doctor left, Graham found Lydia in the library, staring at the shelves of books with undisguised longing. Can you read, Miss Lydia? Yes, sir. Mama taught me. The boys too, though they're not as good yet. Then help yourself. Any book you want. Graham pulled a volume from the shelf, a collection of fairy tales worn from Sarah's frequent reading. This one was my wife's favorite. Maybe you'd like to read it to your brothers. Lydia took the book as if it were made of gold. Really? Really? A house with children should be a house with stories. As if released from some invisible constraint, Lydia's face lit up with the first genuine smile Graham had seen from her. She raced off to find her brothers clutching the book to her chest, and Graham heard her excited voice as she gathered them in the parlor. Elena, watching from her blanket nest on the sofa, caught Graham's eye. You're good with her. With all of them. Graham shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Just treating them like children should be treated. That's rarer than you think. Elena's voice was quiet. Most people see poor children as problems to be solved or ignored. You see them as people. They are people. Yes, but not everyone agrees. She shifted slightly, wincing. I need to tell you something, Mr. Calder. Graham, about our situation. It's worse than you probably think. Graham settled into the chair beside her. I'm listening. Elena's hands twisted in the blanket. My husband's debts. They weren't normal debts. He owed money to a man named Horace Vellum. Do you know him? Graham's jaw tightened. I know him. County councilman. Rich. Connected. Not a man to cross. James borrowed money for seed and equipment, planning to pay it back after harvest. But then the drought hit, and the crops failed, and she shook her head. Vellum wanted his money. James couldn't pay. Then the cholera came, and James died, and Vellum said the debt passed to me. He gave me 30 days to pay $500. $500. A fortune to a widow with 4 children and no resources. And when you couldn't pay, he took everything. Legal, he said, all according to contract. But Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. Just before we left Sweetwater, Vellum came to me, said he'd forgive the debt. All of it. If I'd become his mistress. Ice flooded Graham's veins. You refused. Of course I refused. I'd rather starve than... She broke off, tears sliding down her cheeks. And we nearly did starve, because I chose pride over my children's lives. You chose honor, Graham corrected firmly, and you kept your children safe from a man who sees people as possessions. That's not pride, Elena. That's courage. Vellum said he'd find me, said there was nowhere I could hide that he couldn't reach. Elena's eyes met Graham's, fear and defiance warring in their depths. If he finds out I'm here, he'll make trouble for you. I should leave. As soon as I'm strong enough, you'll do no such thing. Graham's voice was hard as granite. Horace Vellum doesn't run my life, and he sure as hell doesn't dictate who I offer shelter to. You and your children are staying, and that's final. But, Elena! Graham leaned forward, his voice gentle but implacable. I've dealt with men like Vellum before. Bullies who hide behind money and connections. They're dangerous, yes, but they're not invincible, and I'm not a man who runs from a fight. She stared at him, and Graham saw the exact moment when she stopped fighting. Her shoulders sagged, and she nodded slowly. All right, but please be careful. Vellum's not like other men. He's evil, Graham supplied. Vindictive, used to getting his way. He smiled grimly. I know the type, and I know how to handle them. From the parlor came Lydia's voice, reading to her brothers. Once upon a time, in a land far away, there lived a princess who had forgotten how to smile. Elena listened, fresh tears tracking down her face. They sound happy. They are happy, safe, fed, warm, everything children should be. Graham stood. Now rest. I've got ranch work to do, but I'll be close if you need anything. He left her there, listening to her daughter read fairy tales, and stepped out onto the porch. The afternoon sun was bright and hot, the storm a fading memory. His foreman, Miguel, was riding up the main path, and Graham raised a hand in greeting. Boss, Miguel said, reining in his horse. His weathered face was carefully neutral, but Graham saw the curiosity in his eyes. Heard you had visitors last night. News traveled fast, especially among ranch hands. That's right, a woman and her children. They'll be staying for a while. Miguel nodded slowly. Any of my business why? Because they needed help and I could give it. Fair enough? Miguel shifted in his saddle. You know there's going to be talk, right? Town folks can be particular about propriety. Let them talk. Graham's voice was flat. Anything else? South fence needs mending. Found some cattle near the creek that look like they've been harassed. Might be coyotes, might be something else. And Joe's asking about next month's supply run. They spent 20 minutes discussing ranch business, the comfortable back and forth of men who'd worked together long enough to develop a rhythm. Miguel never mentioned the wards again, but Graham caught the slight smile playing at the corners of his foreman's mouth as he rode away. Good. If Miguel approved, the rest of the hands would follow, and Graham suspected he'd need their support in the days ahead. The afternoon passed in a blur of ordinary work, checking cattle, inspecting fence lines, reviewing accounts. But Graham's mind kept drifting back to the house, to the woman recovering on his sofa, and the children filling his empty rooms with life. He'd made a choice last night, a simple choice to open his door and offer help. But simple choices had a way of becoming complicated, of branching into futures that couldn't be predicted or controlled. Graham didn't care. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than numb grief. He felt useful, needed, alive. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Graham rode back toward the ranch house. Smoke curled from the chimney. Lights glowed in the windows. And if he listened carefully, he could hear the faint sound of children's laughter carried on the evening breeze. His house, his land, his life. And now, at least for a while, theirs too. Graham dismounted and stood for a moment, just looking at the house that had been a tomb and was now somehow becoming a home again. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Town gossip, Horace Vellum's potential interference, the logistics of suddenly having 5 additional people under his roof. But tomorrow could take care of itself. Tonight, there were children who needed dinner, and a woman who needed continued care, and a house that needed to remember what it was like to be filled with life. Graham Calder had opened his door to 4 strangers on a desperate night, and in doing so, he'd opened it to something he'd thought lost forever. Hope. The first full day settled into the Calder house like morning mist, soft, pervasive, and transforming everything it touched. Graham woke before dawn, as he always did, but this morning the silence that greeted him felt different. It wasn't the oppressive quiet of an empty house, but rather the hushed stillness of a home holding its breath, waiting for life to stir. He dressed quickly and moved downstairs, half expecting to find the parlor empty, the previous night nothing more than an elaborate dream. But Elena was there, still wrapped in blankets on the sofa, her breathing deep and even. In the early light filtering through the curtains, she looked younger than she had last night, the harsh lines of starvation softened by rest and the promise of recovery. Graham built up the fire and started coffee, the familiar rhythm of morning tasks grounding him in the strange new reality of his situation. He was mixing batter for flapjacks when he heard the soft pad of feet on the stairs. Lydia appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing one of his old shirts as a nightgown, her dark hair tangled from sleep. She stopped when she saw him, uncertainty flickering across her face. "Morning, Miss Lydia," Graham said, keeping his voice low and easy. "Sleep well?" "Yes, sir." She hovered in the doorway, not quite entering. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You're not disturbing anything. Hungry?" The girl's stomach answered before she could, growling loudly enough to make her blush. Graham smiled. I'll take that as a yes. Come sit down. These flapjacks won't eat themselves. Lydia moved to the table with careful steps, as if afraid the moment might shatter. Graham piled her plate high with flapjacks, bacon, and eggs, then watched as she stared at the food with something approaching reverence. Go on, he encouraged. Eat as much as you want. There's plenty more. She ate slowly this time, no longer driven by the desperate hunger of last night, but with obvious pleasure. Graham busied himself at the stove, giving her space, but he could feel her watching him. Mr. Calder? Her voice was tentative. Yes? Why are you being so kind to us? Mama said people don't do things for nothing. They always want something back. Graham turned to face her, leaning against the counter. This child deserved honesty, not platitudes. Your mama's right, in a way. Most people do expect something in return, but here's what I've learned. Kindness isn't a transaction. It's a choice. I'm choosing to help you because I can, and because I remember what it's like to need help and have nowhere to turn. But we can't pay you. Did I ask for payment? No, sir. Then stop worrying about it. Graham poured himself coffee and sat across from her. Miss Lydia, I'm going to be straight with you. You're 10 years old, which means you're old enough to understand hard truths. Your mama's sick. Not dying sick anymore, but recovery sick. She's going to need time to get strong again. Weeks, maybe months. During that time, you and your brothers and sister need a safe place to stay. I have that place. That's the whole story. Lydia studied him with those two old eyes. What about when Mama's better? What happens to us then? It was the question Graham had been avoiding, even in his own thoughts. What would happen when Elena recovered? Would they leave? Should they leave? And why did the thought of this house returning to its previous emptiness make his chest feel tight? I don't know, he admitted. But we've got time to figure it out. For now, let's just focus on today. Can you do that? The girl nodded slowly, then surprised him by smiling, a real smile that transformed her thin face. I like it here, Mr. Calder. It feels safe. Good, because you are safe. All of you. Graham stood and refilled her milk glass. Now, when your brothers wake up, I expect they'll be hungry as bears. Think you can help me keep them from eating the whole kitchen? Lydia giggled, the sound bright and unexpected. Ben and Bo eat everything. Mama always said they had hollow legs. Then we'd better make extra. The twins appeared shortly after, drawn by the smell of bacon and the sound of their sister's laughter. They tumbled into the kitchen with the chaotic energy of 7-year-old boys, identical down to the cowlick in their sandy hair and the scattering of freckles across their noses. Sit, Graham commanded, pointing to the table. Hands washed first. They scrambled to obey, shoving each other good-naturedly at the wash basin. Graham noted with approval that they were quick to follow instructions, no arguing or backtalk. Elena had raised them well despite their circumstances. Mr. Calder, sir, Ben, or possibly Bo, asked around a mouthful of flapjack. You really got cattle? Real ones? I do. About 2,000 head. Both boys' eyes went wide. That's a lot of cows, the other twin breathed. It is indeed. Takes a lot of work to keep them healthy and fed. Could we see them? They asked in unison, then looked at each other and grinned at their timing. Graham felt something warm settle in his chest. When was the last time he'd heard genuine excitement in this house? Tell you what, you boys finish your breakfast, help your sister with the dishes, and then we'll take a walk out to the near pasture. But we do it right. No running off, no spooking the animals. Understood? Yes, sir. They attacked their food with renewed vigor. Elena woke shortly after, and Graham carried her to the kitchen table despite her protests that she could walk. Save your strength, he told her firmly. You'll need it to keep up with those boys of yours. She was stronger today, able to sit upright without swaying, and she ate a full plate of food. Graham watched the color slowly return to her cheeks as she sipped hot tea and listened to her children chatter about their plans for the day. They're going to wear you out, Elena said, catching Graham's eye. There was warmth in her voice, and something else. Gratitude, yes, but also a kind of wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe this was real. I've handled stubborn cattle and broken horses, Graham replied. I think I can manage 2 7-year-old boys. You've never met my two 7-year-old boys, Elena said, but she was smiling. The morning unfolded with surprising ease. True to his word, Graham took the twins out to see the cattle, with Lydia trailing behind, trying to maintain an air of sophisticated disinterest, but clearly just as fascinated. Elena stayed behind with baby Ruth, resting in the parlor but insisting on folding the clean laundry Graham had left in a basket. "You don't have to do that," he'd told her. "I need to do something," she'd replied. "I can't just sit here like a useless lump." Graham had learned enough about stubborn women, his late wife had been one, to know when to let them have their way. In the pasture, the twins were electrified with excitement, asking 1,000 questions about the cattle, the horses, the land, everything. Graham answered patiently, surprised to find he enjoyed explaining things to their eager minds. Lydia, he noticed, asked the most insightful questions, wanting to understand not just what, but why. "Why do you brand them?" she asked, watching from her perch on the fence rail as Graham pointed out his mark on the cattle's flanks. "So everyone knows they're mine. Out here, cattle can wander. The brand proves ownership." "Like a name," she said thoughtfully. "We all got names. I guess cattle need them too, in a way." "That's exactly right, Miss Lydia. You've got a sharp mind." The girl glowed with pride at the compliment, and Graham realized with a start how starved these children were, not just for food, but for attention, praise, the simple acknowledgement that they mattered. They returned to the house for lunch to find Elena in the kitchen, looking exhausted but determined. She'd made sandwiches from the leftover bacon and bread, arranged them on plates with surprising artistry, and had tea steeping in the pot. "You should be resting," Graham said, but his tone lacked conviction. Elena looked more alive than she had since she'd collapsed on his doorstep, and he suspected that feeling useful was as important to her recovery as food and rest. "I rested all morning," Elena replied, "and I needed to thank you properly. For everything." "Sandwiches or thanks enough." They ate together around the kitchen table, and for a moment Graham allowed himself to just observe the scene. The children arguing good-naturedly over who'd gotten the bigger sandwich. Elena laughing at something Bo said, her thin face lighting up with genuine joy. Baby Ruth gurgling contentedly in her basket, well-fed and warm. His house, his table, his food, their laughter, their presence, their life-breathing warmth into cold spaces. The afternoon brought Miguel back, this time with news that couldn't be avoided. "Boss, you got visitors coming up the drive. Looks like Councilman Vellum and Sheriff Cooper." Graham felt every muscle in his body tense. Beside him, Elena went white. "He found us," she whispered. "I told you he would find us." "He doesn't run me off my own land," Graham said flatly. He turned to Miguel. "Take the children upstairs, all of them, and stay with Mrs. Ward." "Graham, no," Elena started. "This isn't a request." His voice was gentle but immovable. "I'll handle this. You keep those children away from him." Miguel ushered the family inside despite Elena's protests. Lydia threw Graham one frightened look over her shoulder before disappearing up the stairs, and he felt rage kindle hot and bright in his chest. These children had just started to feel safe. He'd be damned if he let Horace Vellum take that away. He walked to the front of the house and waited on the porch, arms crossed, as two men on horseback approached. Horace Vellum was exactly as Graham remembered, tall, well-dressed, with silver hair and the kind of face that belonged in a banker's office or a politician's portrait. Sheriff Tom Cooper was a different story, good man, honest lawman, but weak when it came to standing up to powerful people. "Calder," Vellum said, not bothering to dismount. "I understand you're harboring a fugitive." Graham didn't move. "I'm harboring a woman and her children who needed help. If that's a crime, Texas has fallen further than I thought. Elena Ward owes me a substantial debt, $500 plus interest. She absconded from Sweetwater before settling her late husband's obligations." "You'll have to forgive me," Graham said mildly, "but I don't recall asking about Mrs. Ward's financial situation. She knocked on my door during a storm. Christian Charity demanded I help, unless you're suggesting charity is now illegal." Vellum's eyes narrowed. "Don't play games with me, Calder. That woman and her brats are my concern, and I want them returned to Sweetwater immediately." "No." The single word hung in the air like a gunshot. Sheriff Cooper shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Now, Graham, let's be reasonable. I am being reasonable, Tom. Mrs. Ward is recovering from severe malnutrition and exposure. Moving her would be medically dangerous. Doc Matthews can confirm that, if you'd like to ask him. I don't give a damn about her health, Vellum snapped. She owes me money, and she's using you as a shield, probably spinning tales about being mistreated, making herself out to be some kind of victim. Is she not a victim? Graham's voice was dangerously quiet. Widow loses her husband to disease, gets saddled with his debts, loses everything she owns, ends up on the street with 4 children. That sounds like a victim to me. Vellum's face darkened. Her situation is unfortunate, yes, but it doesn't absolve her of legal obligations. The debt is binding. If she can't pay, there are other arrangements. You mean making her your whore? Graham didn't bother to soften the word. That's what you offered her, isn't it? Forgive the debt if she'd warm your bed. Sheriff Cooper's head snapped around. Horace, is that true? I offered her employment as a housekeeper, Vellum said smoothly, but Graham saw the flash of anger in his eyes. If she chose to interpret that as something else, that's her moral failing, not mine. Interesting, Graham said, because I'm looking for a housekeeper myself. Good cook, hard worker, needs a position that includes housing for her and her children. I'm prepared to offer room, board, and a salary of $30 a month. That should cover her debt to you in about 2 years, give or take. Silence descended on the porch. Vellum stared at Graham as if he'd spoken Chinese. You can't be serious. Perfectly serious. Mrs. Ward needs employment. I need help around the house. It's a business arrangement, legal and proper. Graham smiled without warmth. Unless you're suggesting there's something improper about a widow working as a housekeeper for a widower, because that would be quite the accusation. It's highly irregular, Vellum sputtered. So is threatening a starving woman, Graham shot back. But here we are. Sheriff Cooper cleared his throat. Horace, if Calder's willing to take on the debt payments, that seems like a fair solution. Legal and proper, like he said. I don't want his charity. I want what's owed to me. And you'll get it, every penny, just slower than you'd like. Graham's voice hardened. But make no mistake, Vellum, Mrs. Ward and her children are under my protection now. That means you don't come here demanding anything. You don't threaten them. You don't so much as look at them sideways. We clear? Vellum's face had gone purple with rage. You think you can threaten me? I'm on the county council, Calder. I have influence. I can make your life very difficult. You're welcome to try, but I'd think carefully before you do. I employ 30 men year-round, more during drive season. Their families live in town. They spend money in town businesses. They vote in town elections. Graham let that sink in. You want to start a war with me over one woman's debt? You go right ahead, but consider what it'll cost you. The threat was clear and calculated. Vellum had political power, but Graham had economic influence. In a small Texas town, the latter often mattered more than the former. This isn't over, Vellum said finally, yanking his horse's reins with unnecessary force. Yes, it is. Graham's voice was flat. The debt will be paid. Mrs. Ward has legitimate employment. There's nothing more to discuss. Unless you'd like to explain to the good people of Sweetwater why you're harassing a widow and orphans. Vellum glared at him with pure hatred, then spurred his horse forward. Sheriff Cooper lingered a moment longer. You're playing a dangerous game, Graham. No game, Tom, just doing what's right. Right's got a way of being complicated around here. But the sheriff tipped his hat with something approaching respect before following Vellum down the drive. Graham stood on the porch until both men disappeared from view, then let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands were shaking, not with fear, but with suppressed rage. The urge to drag Vellum off his horse and beat him senseless had been almost overwhelming. The door opened behind him. Elena stepped out, her face still pale but her eyes fierce. You didn't have to do that. Take on my debt. Make me your employee. Yes, I did. Graham, Elena. He turned to face her. I meant what I said. You need work. I need help. The rest is just legal window dressing to keep vultures like Vellum at bay. $30 a month. Her voice was soft. That's more than fair. That's generous. It's the going rate for a good housekeeper. It's more than the going rate, and we both know it. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, looking suddenly vulnerable. Why? Why would you tie yourself to my problems? You could have turned me away last night, could have let Vellum take us today. Instead, you're fighting for us. For strangers. Graham was quiet for a long moment, watching the clouds drift across the sky. My wife Sarah died 3 years ago, he said finally. Childbirth. The baby, our son, he didn't make it either. 2 graves on the hill behind the house where I planted roses that never bloomed. Elena's hand went to her mouth. For 3 years, I've been living in a tomb, going through the motions of life without actually living. Eating, sleeping, working, but not feeling anything, not caring about anything, just existing. He looked at her then, and his eyes were raw with emotion. Then you knocked on my door, and for the first time since Sarah died, I felt something, purpose, usefulness, a reason to get up in the morning beyond just habit. Graham, so don't thank me for helping you, he continued. Don't apologize for being here, because the truth is, Elena Ward, you and your children are helping me far more than I'm helping you. You're giving me back something I thought I'd lost forever. You're making this house feel like a home again. Tears streamed down Elena's face. She took a step toward him, then another, and suddenly she was in his arms, sobbing against his chest, while he held her and wondered when the last time anyone had held her was, when the last time she'd felt safe enough to break down. I was so scared, she whispered, so scared he'd take my babies, that I'd lose them because I was too weak, too poor, too... You're not weak. You walked through hell for your children. You're the strongest person I've ever met. Graham's voice was rough with emotion. And you're not losing them. Not to Vellum, not to anyone. I promise you that. They stood like that for several minutes, Elena crying out weeks of fear and exhaustion, while Graham held her and made silent promises to himself about keeping this fragile, fierce woman and her children safe. When she finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, she looked embarrassed. I'm sorry, I don't usually... Stop apologizing. You've earned the right to fall apart. Consider it part of the recovery process. Elena laughed wetly. You're a strange man, Graham called her. So I keep being told. The sound of feet on stairs drew their attention. Lydia appeared, her face tight with worry. Is he gone, Mr. Vellum? He's gone, Graham confirmed, and he won't be back. You're safe here, Miss Lydia, all of you. The tension drained from the girl's thin shoulders. The boys are scared. They heard shouting. Then let's go reassure them, and maybe have some of that pie I saw in the pantry. That evening, after the children were in bed, and Elena had finally succumbed to exhaustion, Graham sat in his study with a glass of whiskey and tried to make sense of what he'd done. In the space of 24 hours, he'd taken in 5 people, made a permanent enemy of a county councilman, and committed himself to paying off someone else's $500 debt. By any rational measure, it was madness. But sitting there in his study, listening to the sounds of life in his house, the creak of floorboards upstairs, the soft murmur of children's voices, the gentle breathing of a woman finally able to rest without fear, Graham couldn't bring himself to regret it. The next few days fell into a pattern that felt almost normal. Elena, gaining strength with each passing day, took over the kitchen with quiet efficiency. She cooked meals that transformed Graham's simple provisions into something approaching art, filling the house with smells that made his mouth water. She cleaned without being asked, mended clothes he'd been meaning to take to the seamstress, organized his chaotic pantry with systematic precision. The children thrived. The twins followed Miguel around the ranch like devoted puppies, learning about cattle and horses and the 1,000 small tasks that kept a spread running. Lydia read voraciously, working her way through Sarah's book collection with fierce determination. Baby Ruth, properly fed and cared for, grew noticeably plumper, her cries becoming less desperate and more the normal fussing of a healthy infant. And Graham found himself looking forward to things again. To breakfast with the family gathered around his table, to the twins' endless questions about ranching, to Lydia's thoughtful observations about whatever book she was currently devouring, to Elena's smile when he complimented her cooking, to the feeling of coming home to a house full of life instead of ghosts. But the town, predictably, had opinions. Graham rode into Sweetwater a week after the Ward family's arrival, needing supplies and wanting to show his face. He'd barely dismounted at the general store when Harold Thompson, the proprietor, greeted him with a knowing look. "Heard you took in some strays, Calder." "Hired a housekeeper," Graham corrected. "Nothing scandalous about that. Housekeeper with 4 children, living under your roof. Unmarried woman and an unmarried man." Harold's tone suggested he found this arrangement questionable at best. "Widow," Graham said flatly, "with children who needed shelter. What was I supposed to do, turn them away? Might have been more proper to find them a place in town, with a respectable family." Graham felt his temper flare. Define respectable, because from where I stand, a woman who walked through hell to keep her children safe is about as respectable as it gets. He bought his supplies in tense silence and stepped outside to find a small cluster of townspeople watching him with undisguised curiosity. Mrs. Patterson, the preacher's wife, approached with the determined stride of someone on a mission from God. "Mr. Calder, we need to speak about your situation." "My situation is my own business, ma'am." "It becomes the community's business when propriety is involved. A widow living with a bachelor, working for a bachelor," Graham interrupted, "as his employee, everything legal and proper. The appearance of impropriety is in the eye of the beholder." Graham's voice was hard. "Mrs. Ward and her children needed help. I provided it. If that offends anyone's delicate sensibilities, they're welcome to take it up with their consciences." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving scandalized whispers in his wake. Let them talk. He'd endured worse than gossip, but the incident bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Not because he cared what the town thought. He'd stopped worrying about others' opinions years ago, but because he knew the gossip would eventually reach Elena and the children. They'd hear the whispers, the speculation, the thinly veiled accusations. They'd been through enough without adding social ostracism to their burdens. That night, after the children were asleep, Graham found Elena in the kitchen, kneading dough for tomorrow's bread. She worked with smooth, practiced motions, and Graham watched for a moment before clearing his throat. "We need to talk." Elena's hand stilled. "About the town." "You've heard?" "Lydia heard Mrs. Patterson talking at the store yesterday, asked me what impropriety meant." Elena's voice was carefully neutral. "I explained it meant some people thought we shouldn't be living here, that it wasn't proper." "Elena, she asked if we should leave, if staying here was hurting you." Elena turned to face him, flour dusting her hands. "I didn't have an answer for her, Graham, because I don't know. Maybe we should find somewhere else. Maybe staying here is making things worse for you." "No." The word came out harder than Graham intended. "Absolutely not. You're not leaving because some narrow-minded gossips can't mind their own business. But they'll make your life difficult. Let them try." Graham moved closer, his voice intense. "Elena, listen to me. I don't give a damn what this town thinks. Not about me, not about you, not about any of it. You and your children are staying. That's not up for debate. We're ruining your reputation. I'll survive." He softened his tone. "Besides, what kind of reputation is worth having if it requires throwing a widow and orphans to the wolves?" Elena stared at him, and something shifted in her expression, something warm and wondering and almost frightening in its intensity. "You really mean that?" "Every word." She turned back to her dough, but her hands were shaking. "I don't understand you, Graham Calder. Most men would have expected things in exchange for helping us. Or they would have tired of us by now, wanted us gone. I'm not most men." "No." Her voice was soft. "You're really not." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the rhythmic working of dough under Elena's hands. Finally, Graham spoke. "There's something else, something I think we should discuss." "What's that?" "The children, specifically their education. Lydia's bright as hell, but she needs proper schooling. The twins, too. And there's a decent school in town." Elena's hands stopped moving. "I can't afford. I'm not asking you to pay. I'm saying that as part of your employment here, your children's education is covered." "Graham, this isn't charity. It's logistics. Smart children become smart adults. Smart adults build better futures. I'd be a fool not to invest in that." He paused. Besides, Lydia reminds me of my sister at that age, hungry for knowledge. It'd be a crime not to feed that hunger. Elena turned to him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Why are you doing this? Really? Because I can't figure it out. Nobody is this kind without wanting something. Graham considered the question seriously. Why was he doing this? The easy answer was because he could, because he remembered being in their position, because it was the right thing to do. But standing there in his kitchen, watching this woman who'd survived hell through sheer willpower fight back tears over the idea of her children getting an education, Graham realized the truth was more complicated. You want honesty? He asked. Always. When Sarah died, I died too. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. I stopped caring about anything. The ranch ran itself. The money accumulated. I went through the motions of living, but inside I was empty. Just hollow. He swallowed hard. Then you knocked on my door, and suddenly I had a reason to get up in the morning. Someone needed me. Multiple someones. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt like maybe I could be useful again. Like maybe my life could have purpose beyond just existing. Elena's tears spilled over. We're giving you purpose? You're giving me everything. A reason to care, a reason to fight. A house that feels like a home instead of a tomb. Graham's voice was raw. So yeah, I'm helping you, but you're helping me right back. Fair trade as I see it. She crossed the kitchen before he could react and kissed him, soft and quick, barely more than a brush of lips, but enough to make Graham's heart stutter in his chest. Then she pulled back, her face flushed. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. For seeing us as people instead of problems. For giving my children a chance. For... Her voice broke. For making me feel human again. Graham's hand came up to cup her cheek, and he was stunned by how natural the gesture felt. You're the most human person I've ever met, Elena Ward. Never forget that. They stood there, caught in a moment that felt suspended outside of time, until baby Ruth's cry echoed from upstairs. Elena jumped back, wiping her eyes quickly. I should... Go. Take care of your daughter. She fled, leaving Graham alone in the kitchen with the smell of rising dough and the ghost of her kiss still tingling on his lips. He touched his mouth, surprised to find himself smiling. Dangerous territory, this. Getting attached, letting himself care, opening himself up to the possibility of loss again. But as he heard Elena's soft voice soothing Ruth upstairs, as he thought about Lydia's fierce intelligence and the twins' boundless energy and the way this house had transformed from tomb to home, Graham couldn't bring himself to care about the danger. For the first time in 3 years, he was alive. And that, he thought, was worth any risk. The weeks that followed moved like water finding its course, sometimes smooth, sometimes turbulent, but always flowing forward. Elena grew stronger each day, the hollow places in her cheeks filling out, the shadows under her eyes fading to memory. The children bloomed like wildflowers after rain, their laughter becoming as much a part of the house as the creak of floorboards and the whistle of wind through the eaves. Graham found himself restructuring his entire life around their presence, and the strange thing was how natural it felt. He took breakfast with the family every morning, listening to the twins' excited chatter about whatever adventure Miguel had promised them that day. He spent evenings in the parlor while Lydia read aloud to her brothers, her voice clear and confident as she brought stories to life. He even found himself rocking baby Ruth to sleep some nights, humming old songs his adoptive mother had once sung to him. It was domestic, ordinary, everything his life hadn't been for 3 long years. And he'd never been happier. But happiness, Graham had learned, was a fragile thing. It could shatter in an instant, destroyed by forces beyond anyone's control. He just hadn't expected those forces to strike quite so soon, or quite so viciously. The first sign of trouble came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the Ward's arrival. Graham was in the barn checking on a mare about to foal when Miguel appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grim. "Boss, we got a problem. Big one." Graham straightened, reading the tension in his foreman's posture. "What kind of problem?" "Water kind. The creek's running low, real low. And I rode upstream to check. Someone's built a dam, diverting our water." Ice flooded Graham's veins. Water was life in Texas. Control the water, control the land. Control the land, Control the people who depended on it. Show me. They rode out together, following the creek that fed Graham's cattle and irrigated his fields. Miguel was right. The flow had diminished to barely a trickle, nothing like the robust stream that should have been running this time of year. 2 miles upstream, they found the dam, a crude but effective structure of logs and stones, channeling the water into a new course that led away from Graham's property. "How long?" Graham asked, his voice deadly calm. "Can't have been more than a day or two. I checked this section last week, and everything was fine." Miguel spat into the dust. "This is deliberate, boss. Someone's trying to choke us out." Graham didn't need to ask who. Only one man had both the motive and the arrogance to pull something like this. Vellum. That'd be my guess. His land's east of here. This new channel would flow right onto his property. Miguel's jaw was tight with anger. "What do you want to do?" Graham stared at the dam, his mind working through implications and consequences. If the water stayed diverted, his cattle would suffer. His fields would dry up. His ranch, everything he'd built, would slowly die. And Vellum knew it. This was punishment, retaliation for protecting Elena and her children. A message that defying Horace Vellum came with a price. "Tear it down," Graham said flatly. "Every log, every stone. Put the creek back where it belongs." "Vellum's not going to like that." "I don't particularly care what Vellum likes." Graham wheeled his horse around. "Get some men. Do it now. I'm going to town to have a conversation with our esteemed councilman." The ride to Sweetwater gave Graham time to let his rage cool into something harder and more useful. Anger made men stupid. He couldn't afford stupidity, not with 5 people depending on him. By the time he reached Vellum's office, a pretentious building on Main Street with his name painted in gold letters, Graham had his fury locked down tight. Vellum's secretary, a nervous young man with ink-stained fingers, tried to block his entry. "Mr. Vellum is in a meeting." Graham walked past him without breaking stride and threw open the office door. Vellum sat behind an enormous mahogany desk, a cigar in one hand and papers spread before him. He looked up at Graham's entrance, and his expression shifted from surprise to smug satisfaction. "Calder, I wondered when you'd show up." "The dam." Graham's voice was flat. "Take it down." "I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play games. You dammed the creek that runs through my land. That's illegal, and we both know it." Vellum leaned back in his chair, studying his cigar with theatrical interest. "Is it illegal? I was under the impression that water rights in Texas are remarkably fluid. Pardon the pun. That creek has run through Calder land for 30 years. I've got legal water rights documented with the county." Yes. About that." Vellum opened a drawer and pulled out a folder, spreading documents across his desk. "I've been reviewing the county records. Fascinating reading. It appears there's some ambiguity about where exactly your water rights begin and end. The upstream portion, the section where this alleged dam is located, might actually fall under disputed territory." Graham's hands clenched into fists. "That's horseshit, and you know it." "Language, Calder. We're civilized men here." Vellum's smile was poisonous. "But if you feel there's an error in the county records, you're welcome to petition for a review. Of course, that process can take months, maybe years. In the meantime," he shrugged, "water flows where it will." The threat was crystal clear. Vellum could tie Graham up in legal proceedings while his cattle died of thirst and his land turned to dust. And they both knew Graham didn't have months to wait for bureaucratic resolution. "What do you want?" Graham asked quietly. "What I've always wanted. Elena Ward and her children return to Sweetwater, where they belong. She has debts to settle, obligations to fulfill. Her debt is being paid. $30 a month, like we agreed. That wasn't an agreement. That was you forcing a solution I never accepted." Vellum stood, moving to the window overlooking Main Street. "You think you can defy me? Take what's mine. There are consequences, Calder. I tried to be reasonable, but you've left me no choice but to take more direct action. You're destroying my ranch because of a woman? I'm protecting my interests. Elena Ward belongs to me. Her husband's debt makes her mine until it's paid in full, and I prefer immediate payment." Vellum turned, his eyes cold. "So here's my offer. Return her to Sweetwater. and the water situation resolves itself. The dam comes down, your cattle drink their fill, everyone's happy. Refuse, and he smiled. Well, Texas summers are brutal without water, aren't they? Graham stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time the depth of Vellum's depravity. This wasn't about money or debt or even pride. This was about power, about owning people, about ensuring that no one, especially not a poor widow, could escape his control. No, Graham said simply. Vellum's face darkened. You're willing to lose everything over one woman? I'm willing to lose everything rather than hand someone over to a monster. Graham's voice was steady despite the rage burning in his chest. You want a war, Vellum? You've got one. But understand this, I don't fight clean and I don't surrender, ever. Brave words from a man whose cattle are about to start dying. My men are tearing down your dam as we speak, and if you rebuild it, I'll tear it down again, every single time. You want to play games with water rights? Fine. I'll hire lawyers. I'll petition the territorial governor. I'll make enough noise that every newspaper from here to Austin starts asking questions about how a county councilman uses public resources for personal vendettas. Vellum's expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that might have been uncertainty. Graham pressed his advantage. You're used to bullying people who can't fight back. Poor widows, desperate men, people without resources or connections. Graham leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. I'm not those people. I've got money, land, and 30 men who'd ride through hell for me. You want this fight? Bring it. But know that I'll drag you through so much mud that even your political friends won't be able to clean you up. Silence stretched between them, taut as a drawn bowstring. Finally, Vellum smiled, a cold, calculating expression that made Graham's skin crawl. You care about her? Care about the widow? It wasn't a question. That's your weakness, Calder. You've gotten attached. My feelings are none of your concern. Oh, but they are, because now I know exactly how to hurt you. Vellum returned to his desk, his movements casual. The water situation is just the beginning. There are so many ways to make life difficult. Supply shipments that mysteriously never arrive. Bank loans that suddenly come due. County inspections that find all sorts of violations. He paused. And of course, there's always the court of public opinion, a bachelor and a widow living together, unmarried. People talk. Churches disapprove. It would be such a shame if that poor woman and her children found themselves completely ostracized. No one willing to sell them food. No school willing to take the children. Can you imagine? Graham felt sick. Vellum was right. He could make Elena and the children's lives unbearable without ever laying a hand on them. Social pressure, economic isolation, systematic harassment, death by 1,000 cuts. You're a real piece of work, Graham said quietly. I'm a businessman protecting my assets. Nothing personal. Vellum sat down, already turning his attention to the papers on his desk. You have until the end of the week to reconsider. After that, things get considerably worse. Show yourself out. Graham left the office before he did something stupid like punch Vellum in his smug face. The ride back to the ranch felt twice as long as usual, his mind churning through options and finding none that didn't end in disaster. He could fight. God knows he wanted to fight. But fighting Vellum would cost him everything. Money, reputation, possibly the ranch itself. And even if he won, the collateral damage would destroy Elena and the children. They'd be caught in the crossfire, subjected to harassment and isolation that would make their lives miserable. Maybe they would be better off without him. Maybe he should let them go. Find somewhere Vellum couldn't reach them, somewhere they could start fresh without the burden of Graham's protection dragging them down. The thought made his chest ache, but he couldn't ignore the logic. He'd wanted to save them. Maybe saving them meant letting them go. He arrived home to find Elena in the kitchen, flour dusting her apron as she rolled out pie dough. She looked up at his entrance, and her smile faded instantly. What happened? Graham wanted to lie, to spare her the knowledge of Vellum's threats. But she deserved truth, not comfortable fiction. He told her everything, the dam, the confrontation, Vellum's ultimatum. With each word, Elena's face grew paler, her hand stilling on the rolling pin. He's going to destroy you, she whispered when Graham finished. Because of me. Because you won't hand me over. This isn't your fault. Of course it is. If we hadn't come here, if I hadn't knocked on your door, then you'd be dead, and your children would be orphans. Graham's voice was harsh. Don't you dare apologize for surviving. Elena's eyes filled with tears. But what do we do? He has all the power. He can take your water, ruin your business, turn the whole town against you. How do we fight that? I don't know. The admission cost him. Graham Calder always had a plan, always knew what to do, but this situation felt impossible, a trap with no escape. Maybe you and the children should leave. Find another town, somewhere Vellum can't reach you. No. Elena's voice was fierce. We're not running anymore. Elena, I said no. She moved around the table to stand in front of him, her chin lifted in defiance despite the tears streaming down her face. We've been running my whole life. From poverty, from debt, from men like Vellum who think they can own people. I'm done running. If we leave, he wins. He gets to keep being a monster who destroys anyone who defies him. He'll destroy me if you stay. Then we'll figure something out, together. Elena grabbed his hands. You said you'd protect us, that we were safe here. Did you mean it? Yes, but no buts. Either you meant it or you didn't. Her grip tightened. I trust you, Graham, more than I've trusted anyone in my life. So if you say we'll find a way through this, I believe you. But I need you to believe it too. Graham looked down at their joined hands, at this woman who'd walked through hell and somehow still had the strength to stand and fight. She was right. Running would solve nothing. Vellum would just find another victim, another person to torment. The cycle would continue, unless someone stood up and said enough. All right, Graham said slowly. We fight, but we do it smart, and we might lose everything in the process. I've already lost everything once. I survived. Elena's smile was tremulous but real, and this time I'm not alone. That night, after the children were asleep, Graham sat with Elena and Miguel at the kitchen table, mapping out strategy like generals planning a war. Miguel had successfully torn down the dam, but he reported that Vellum's men had been watching from a distance, making notes. They'll rebuild, Miguel said grimly. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And next time they'll guard it. Then we guard our section of the creek, Graham replied. Post men in shifts. Anyone tries to interfere with our water, we stop them. That's asking for violence, boss. Someone's going to get hurt. Better than watching my cattle die of thirst. Graham rubbed his face, exhaustion pulling at him. What about legal options? Could we get an injunction? Take weeks at minimum, and the nearest judge friendly to our cause is in Austin. Miguel shook his head. Vellum owns most of the local legal system. He's been buying influence for years. Elena had been quiet, listening intently. Now she spoke up. What if we went over his head? He said you'd drag him through the newspapers. Were you bluffing? Partly, but newspapers do like a good scandal. Graham considered. Problem is proving anything. Vellum's careful. Everything he does has plausible deniability. What about his debt collection practices? Elena's voice was soft but determined. I can't be the only widow he's threatened. There must be others, women he's coerced or intimidated. If we could find them, get them to talk. Miguel let out a low whistle. That's dangerous thinking, Senora. Women like that, they're scared. Getting them to testify against a powerful man, most would rather stay silent. I know. Elena's hands were clasped tight on the table. But I also know that sometimes one person speaking up gives others courage. If I tell my story publicly, maybe others will too. Graham stared at her. You do that? Put yourself out there, let everyone know what Vellum tried to make you do? If it stops him from doing it to someone else? Yes. She met his gaze steadily. I'm tired of being ashamed of things that aren't my fault. Vellum's the one who should be ashamed. Maybe it's time someone told him that. The plan took shape slowly over the next few days. Graham wrote to a journalist in Austin he'd met years ago, outlining the situation without names initially, testing interest. The response was immediate and encouraging. Corruption stories sold papers, and a county councilman abusing his power made good copy. Meanwhile, Elena began quietly reaching out through the network of women in town. The seamstress, the boarding house keeper, the widow who ran the dry goods store. Conversations whispered in back rooms and behind closed doors. Women sharing stories they'd kept locked inside for years. Graham watched Elena transform from victim to advocate, her strength growing with each woman who trusted her enough to speak. But Vellum wasn't idle. 3 days after their confrontation, the first real blow landed. Graham returned from checking the herd to find Lydia sitting on the porch steps, her face blotchy with tears. What happened? He knelt beside her, alarm spiking through him. The school. Lydia's voice was thick with tears. Miss Patterson came by, said the school board met. They decided Ben and Beau and me can't attend anymore. They said it's because Mama's living here unmarried, and it's setting a bad example. White-hot rage flooded Graham's vision. He stood, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles cracked. Where's your mother? Inside with the twins. They're real upset, Mr. Calder. Ben was so excited about going to school. He'd been practicing his letters every night. Graham found Elena in the parlor, holding both boys while they cried. She looked up at his entrance, her face a mask of devastation. They can't go to school, she said flatly, because of me. Because people think I'm... She cut herself off, glancing at her sons. Mrs. Patterson was very clear about the reasons. This is Vellum's doing. Graham's voice was hard. Turning the town against you, making sure you feel the pressure. It's working. Elena's voice broke. Graham, they're children. They deserve an education. They deserve friends and normal lives. How can I give them that when everyone thinks their mother is a... Don't. Graham crossed the room and crouched in front of her. Don't let him put those words in your mouth. You're a good woman and a good mother. Anyone who says different is a fool. But the school can go to hell. The curse slipped out before Graham could stop it, earning shocked looks from the twins. He softened his voice. Sorry, boys, but I mean it. If they won't teach you at their school, we'll find another way. There is no other way, Elena said helplessly. The schoolhouse is the only one for 50 miles. Graham's mind raced. Then an idea struck. So simple, he almost laughed. I'll hire a tutor. Private teacher here at the house. Problem solved. Elena stared at him. That would cost a fortune. So? I've got a fortune. Graham looked at the twins, their tear-streaked faces so full of confused hurt. Besides, I never liked that school anyway. Teachers are too strict. A private tutor can actually teach you interesting things. Really? Beau, or possibly Ben, asked, his voice small and hopeful. Really. In fact, I know just the person, Miss Sarah Thornton. She taught school in Austin before moving here to care for her mother. Smart as a whip and kind as they come. I bet she'd jump at the chance to teach 3 bright children. Lydia appeared in the doorway. You'd really do that? Hire someone just to teach us? Why not? This house has 6 empty bedrooms. Miss Thornton can live here, make it proper and respectable. 2 unmarried women as chaperones. Graham stood, warming to the idea. Vellum wants to isolate you? Fine. We'll build our own world right here. School, family, everything you need. For the first time since the confrontation with Mrs. Patterson, hope flickered across Elena's face. You think Miss Thornton would agree? Only one way to find out. Sarah Thornton agreed with an enthusiasm that surprised even Graham. A spinster in her early 40s, intelligent and kind with a spine of solid steel, she'd been suffocating in Sweetwater's narrow-minded social circles for years. The chance to teach children who actually wanted to learn, in a household that wouldn't judge her for being unmarried and educated, was irresistible. She moved into the Calder house 3 days later, bringing boxes of books and teaching materials that made Lydia's eyes go wide with delight. The transformation was immediate. Mornings became structured around lessons: reading, writing, arithmetic, history, science. The children thrived under Sarah's patient instruction, and even baby Ruth seemed to absorb the atmosphere of learning, gurgling contentedly from her basket while her siblings recited their lessons. But the respite was brief. 2 weeks after Sarah's arrival, Graham woke to find Miguel pounding on his bedroom door in the pre-dawn darkness. "Boss, fire! The south barn's burning!" Graham was dressed and running before Miguel finished speaking. He burst outside to see flames leaping into the black sky, consuming the barn where they stored hay and equipment. His men were already forming bucket lines, but Graham knew immediately it was hopeless. The fire was too big, too hot, spreading too fast. "Everyone out!" he roared. "Don't risk yourselves. Let it burn!" They stood in a ragged line and watched 3 years of stored hay and thousands of dollars in equipment turn to ash. As dawn broke, revealing the full extent of the destruction, Miguel approached Graham with something clutched in his hand. "Found this near where the fire started." He held up a lantern, its glass cracked, the smell of kerosene still strong. "Doesn't belong to any of our men. Someone set this, boss." Graham took the lantern, rage and exhaustion making his hand shake. Vellum. It had to be. Another escalation, another message. Defy me and watch everything you've built burn. From the house, Graham could see Elena standing on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, her face pale in the growing light. She'd seen the fire, knew what it meant. Their eyes met across the distance, and Graham saw his own desperation reflected back at him. They were losing. Slowly but surely, Vellum was destroying everything Graham had worked for. The water situation remained precarious despite their guards. The town had turned cold and hostile, refusing to serve Elena or the children in stores, crossing the street to avoid them. Now this fire, this blatant act of arson, how much more could they endure? How much more could he ask Elena and the children to endure? That afternoon, while his men cleaned up the debris, Graham sat in his study and stared at the ledgers spread before him. The financial damage from the fire was significant, but not crippling. He could rebuild the barn, replace the equipment, but money couldn't fix the larger problem. Vellum had them in a vice, and he was steadily tightening his grip. A knock at the door interrupted his dark thoughts. Elena entered without waiting for permission, closing the door behind her with quiet determination. "We need to talk," she said. "Elena, if this is about leaving, it's about staying." She moved to his desk, placing her hands flat on its surface. "And it's about ending this, permanently." Graham looked up at her, seeing something new in her expression. Not fear, not defeat, something harder and more dangerous. "I'm listening." "Vellum wants to break us through isolation and economic pressure. He's betting we'll crack before he does." Elena's voice was steady. "But there's one thing he hasn't counted on." "What's that?" "That I'm done being a victim, that I'm ready to fight dirty." She leaned forward. "You said newspapers love a scandal. Let's give them one they can't ignore." Over the next hour, Elena laid out a plan so audacious it took Graham's breath away. She'd been talking to more women, not just in Sweetwater but in neighboring towns. Vellum's reach was wide, and everywhere he went, he left a trail of intimidated widows and desperate families. Elena had found 5 women willing to testify publicly about his debt collection practices, his coercion, his threats. "We go to the journalist," Elena said. "Tell him everything. My story, their stories. Make it too big to ignore. The territorial governor will have to investigate. Vellum will destroy you for this." "Your reputation?" "My reputation?" Elena laughed bitterly. "Graham, I'm already ruined in this town's eyes. Living with you unwed, keeping my children from school, being a poor widow with debts. I've got nothing left to lose except my dignity, and I'm willing to sacrifice that if it stops him from hurting anyone else." Graham stared at this woman who'd arrived on his doorstep 3 weeks ago barely alive, and saw not a victim, but a warrior. "You're sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Her eyes blazed. "He took everything from me once. I won't let him do it again, and I won't let him take you or this ranch or anything else. It ends now." Graham stood and moved around the desk, taking Elena's hands in his. "If we do this, there's no going back. Vellum will come at us with everything he has. It could get dangerous." "I know. The children will be safer in a world where men like Vellum can't operate with impunity." Elena's grip tightened. "I'm doing this for them, so they grow up knowing their mother fought back, so they never think they have to accept being victims." Graham looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't just about protection anymore. This wasn't charity or obligation or even friendship. This was something deeper, something that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. "Then we fight," he said quietly. "Together. All the way." Elena's smile was fierce and beautiful. together. But before they could put their plan into action, fate dealt another devastating blow. It came 3 nights later, in the dark hours between midnight and dawn when the world was at its most vulnerable. Graham woke to screaming. He was running before he was fully conscious, his heart hammering as he recognized the source. Elena, her voice raw with terror, crying out from the room where she slept with baby Ruth. He burst through the door to find her standing over Ruth's cradle, the lamp shaking in her hand, her face a mask of absolute horror. "She's not breathing," Elena gasped. "Graham, she's not breathing." Graham crossed the room in 2 strides and looked down at Ruth. The baby was limp, her lips tinged blue, her tiny chest motionless. No cry, no movement, nothing. Time seemed to stop. Then training kicked in, memories of helping birth calves, of reviving foals that came too early, of Miguel teaching him what to do when lungs forgot their purpose. Graham scooped Ruth up, supporting her head, and began the delicate work of stimulating her breathing, gentle taps on her back, clearing her airway, breathing softly into her nose and mouth. "Come on, baby girl," he murmured. "Come on, breathe." Nothing. Behind him, Elena's sobs were quiet and desperate. Lydia and the twins had appeared in the doorway, their faces white with fear. Sarah stood behind them, one hand over her mouth. Graham kept working, refusing to give up, refusing to let this child die in his arms. Not after everything, not when they'd come so far. "Breathe," he commanded, as if the baby could hear him and obey. "Breathe, Ruth. Come on." A shudder ran through the tiny body. Then a gasp, wet and ragged, but unmistakably a breath. Ruth's eyes flew open, and she began to wail, the most beautiful sound Graham had ever heard. Elena collapsed, her knees buckling. Graham caught her with one arm, while cradling Ruth with the other, holding both of them as Elena sobbed with relief and Ruth's cries filled the room. "She's breathing," Elena kept repeating. "She's breathing. Oh God, she's breathing." The crisis passed, but it left them all shaken. Doc Matthews came at first light and examined Ruth thoroughly, his expression grave. "She's got a weak respiratory system," he said finally. "Could be congenital, could be from the malnutrition early in her life. Either way, it makes her vulnerable. This could happen again." "What do we do?" Elena's voice was barely a whisper. "Watch her closely. Keep her warm. If she shows any signs of distress, bluish color, labored breathing, listlessness, you act immediately." Doc Matthews looked at Graham. "You did good work tonight. Another few minutes and—" He didn't finish the sentence. After the doctor left, Graham found Elena in Ruth's room, sitting beside the cradle, watching her daughter sleep. She didn't look up at his entrance. "I almost lost her," she said quietly. "After everything, the hunger, the storm, the journey here, I almost lost her to something I couldn't fight or fix." Graham sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "But you didn't lose her. She's here. She's breathing. She's alive. Because of you." Elena turned to him, her eyes red-rimmed but fierce. "You saved her life, Graham. You brought her back. I just did what needed doing." "No." Elena's hand found his. "You did what love does. You fought for her. You refused to give up. You—" Her voice broke. "You're not just protecting us anymore. You're part of us. Part of this family." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Family. Not employer and housekeeper. Not benefactor and charity case. Family. Graham looked at their joined hands, at Ruth sleeping peacefully in her cradle, at the woman beside him who'd become so much more than he'd ever anticipated. He thought about the twins learning their letters downstairs, about Lydia devouring books in the library, about Sarah teaching lessons at the kitchen table, about Miguel and the ranch hands who'd become protective of these 5 people who'd stumbled into their lives. Family. Maybe that's what they'd been building all along, without realizing it. "Elena," he said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you." She looked at him, waiting. "When Vellum came to my office, he said I'd gotten attached, that caring about you was my weakness." Graham's voice was rough. "He was right. I do care. More than I should. More than is probably wise given our situation. I care about you and your children more than I've cared about anything since Sarah died." Elena's breath caught. I'm not saying this to pressure you or make things complicated, Graham continued quickly. I know you're still recovering, still building a life for yourself and your kids. I'm not expecting anything. I needed you to know that this, he gestured vaguely, this isn't obligation anymore. It hasn't been for a while. Elena was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, slow and sweet and full of promise. I care too, she whispered against his lips. More than I should. More than is probably wise. But I don't care about wise anymore. I just care about true. And this? She echoed his gesture. This is true. They sat together in the quiet room, listening to Ruth breathe, and Graham felt something he'd thought lost forever. Hope for a future that might include happiness. But the world, as always, had other plans. The next morning brought news that turned that fragile hope into ashes. Horace Vellum had filed a formal petition with the county court, claiming that Elena was an unfit mother living in morally questionable circumstances. He was demanding custody of all 4 children, citing his position as her creditor and his concern for their welfare. The fight Graham and Elena had been preparing for had just become a war for everything that mattered, and they had exactly 2 weeks before the custody hearing that could tear their newfound family apart. The custody petition landed like a bomb in the middle of their lives, scattering everything they'd carefully built into jagged pieces. Elena read the document with shaking hands, her face growing paler with each word. When she finished, she set it down on the kitchen table with such careful precision that Graham knew she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. He wants to take them. Her voice was flat, emotionless, in the way of someone too shocked to fully process what was happening. All of them. He's claiming I'm morally unfit because I'm living here with you. He's saying the children are being raised in a house of sin. Graham picked up the petition, his jaw tightening as he read Vellum's carefully crafted arguments. It was brilliant in its cruelty, taking the town's existing prejudices and codifying them into legal language. An unmarried woman living with an unmarried man, children removed from proper schooling, exposure to questionable moral influences. Each point designed to paint Elena as a negligent mother who'd chosen her own comfort over her children's welfare. This is insane, Sarah said from the doorway, where she'd been listening. Elena's a wonderful mother. Anyone with eyes can see that. Anyone with eyes and a conscience, Graham corrected grimly. But this isn't about truth. This is about Vellum using the law as a weapon. And he knows exactly how to do it. Elena's hands twisted in her apron. What if he wins, Graham? What if he actually takes them? The raw terror in her voice made Graham's chest ache. He moved around the table and gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. He won't. We won't let him. How do we stop this? He has the law on his side. He has money, influence, respectability. What do we have? The truth. Graham's voice was hard. And we're going to make sure everyone hears it. The next 2 weeks became a desperate race against time. Graham hired the best lawyer he could find, Marcus Webb from Austin, a man with a reputation for taking on powerful opponents and winning. Webb arrived 3 days after the petition was filed, a thin man in his 50s with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. This is bad, he said after reviewing the case. I won't lie to you. Vellum's positioned himself well. In the eyes of the law, unmarried men and women living together is scandalous regardless of the actual circumstances. Add in his claim as creditor with a vested interest in the family's welfare, and you've got a case that could go either way. So what do we do? Graham asked. Webb leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. We attack his credibility. If we can prove that Vellum's motivations are vindictive rather than concerned, if we can show a pattern of harassment and abuse, the judge might see through his righteous pretense. Mrs. Ward, you mentioned other women he's threatened? Elena nodded. 5 that I know of personally. More if we keep digging. Get them to testify. I need statements, affidavits, anything that shows Vellum uses debt as a tool of coercion. We need to paint him as the predator he is, not the concerned citizen he's pretending to be. Webb turned to Graham. And you, your reputation matters here. We need character witnesses. People who can testify to your integrity, your standing in the community. Can you get them? Graham thought of his ranch hands, his business associates, the few friends he'd maintained over the years. I can try. Try hard. Because right now, public opinion is probably running against you. Changing that narrative is crucial. The work began immediately. Elena reached out to the women she'd been quietly networking with, asking them to put their stories on paper. It was harder than expected. Most were terrified of Vellum's retribution, afraid of what speaking out might cost them. But slowly, painfully, Elena's persistence paid off. First one woman agreed, then another. Each story was a variation on the same theme: debt, desperation, and Vellum's calculated exploitation of both. Meanwhile, Graham worked on his own testimony. Miguel stood by him without hesitation, as did Doc Matthews once he heard the full story. More surprising was Harold Thompson from the general store, who admitted that Vellum had been pressuring him to refuse service to Elena and the children. I never liked it, Harold said gruffly. Felt wrong, punishing kids for adult business. If you need me to say so in court, I will. Others followed. Not many, but enough. The blacksmith, the livery owner, even old Mrs. Chen, who ran the boarding house and had her own stories about Vellum's strong-arm tactics. A picture began to emerge of a man who wielded power through fear and intimidation, who saw people as assets to be controlled rather than humans deserving of dignity. But while they built their case, life at the ranch grew increasingly tense. The children knew something was wrong despite everyone's attempts to shield them. Lydia, sharp as ever, had overheard enough to piece together the situation. Mr. Vellum wants to take us away, doesn't he? She asked Graham one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Her voice was small but steady. Graham considered lying, softening the truth. But Lydia deserved better than comfortable fiction. He's trying, but we're fighting it. What if he wins? He won't. But what if he does? Lydia turned to him, her young face creased with worry far beyond her years. Where would we go? Would we stay together? The question hit Graham like a fist to the gut. He hadn't thought about that, about what would happen if Vellum actually succeeded. Would he separate the children, send them to different homes, use them as leverage to finally force Elena into submission? Lydia, Graham chose his words carefully, I promise you with everything I am that I will not let that man take you or your brothers or your sister. Not now, not ever. Do you understand me? But how can you stop him if the judge says, then I'll appeal. I'll take it to a higher court. I'll fight until there's no fight left. Graham's voice was fierce. And if all legal options fail, I'll pack you all up and we'll go somewhere they can't reach us. Montana, California, hell, Canada if we have to. But I will not let Horace Vellum destroy this family. Lydia stared at him, and slowly her expression shifted from fear to something else, something that looked like trust. You really mean that? Every word. She threw her arms around his neck suddenly, squeezing tight. I don't want to leave. I like it here. I like you and Miguel and Miss Sarah. I like having a home. Graham held her, this brave girl who'd been forced to grow up too fast, and made a silent vow. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, he would protect this family. They'd become his family, not by blood but by choice, by circumstance, by the bonds forged through adversity and care. He would not fail them. The custody hearing was set for a Wednesday morning in the county courthouse. Graham woke before dawn, his stomach churning with nerves he hadn't felt since his first cattle drive. He dressed carefully in his best suit, the one he'd worn to Sarah's funeral and hadn't touched since, and came downstairs to find Elena already in the kitchen. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she'd slept as poorly as he had. But she'd dressed carefully too, in the one decent dress Sarah Thornton had helped her alter. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun, her face scrubbed clean. She looked respectable, maternal, nothing like the wanton woman Vellum's petition had painted her as. Coffee? She offered, her voice hoarse. Please. They sat together in silence, the weight of the coming day pressing down on both of them. Upstairs, Graham could hear Sarah getting the children ready. They'd decided to bring them to court. Risky, but Webb had argued that seeing the children happy and healthy might sway the judge. Let him see what he'd be destroying if he sided with Vellum. Graham? Elena's voice broke the silence. If this goes wrong, it won't. But if it does, she reached across the table and took his hand. I need you to know, these last weeks, they've been the happiest of my life. You gave me and my children something I thought we'd lost forever. Hope, safety, a place to belong. No matter what happens today, I'll never forget that. Graham's throat tightened. Elena, let me finish. Her grip on his hand intensified. You've been everything to us. More than a protector, more than an employer. You've been the father my children needed. The partner I didn't know I was looking for. And if we get through this, if we win, I want... She faltered, color rising in her cheeks. I want to find a way for this to be permanent, real, not just an arrangement, but a life, together. Graham stared at her, his heart hammering. Was she saying what he thought she was saying? Before he could respond, footsteps on the stairs announced the children's arrival. Lydia appeared first, holding Ruth, with the twins trailing behind. They all looked nervous, dressed in their best clothes, scrubbed and combed within an inch of their lives. We ready? Ben asked, his voice small. We're ready, Graham confirmed, standing. He looked at Elena, holding her gaze. All of us. Together. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived. News of the custody hearing had spread through Sweetwater like wildfire, and it seemed half the town had turned out to watch. Graham felt their eyes on his family as they walked through the crowd, some sympathetic, most judgmental, all curious. Vellum was already there, seated at the plaintiff's table with his own lawyer, a slick man from Dallas named Pritchard. Vellum watched them enter with a small, satisfied smile that made Graham's hands curl into fists. Remember, Marcus Webb whispered, stay calm. Don't let him provoke you. Everything we do today is about showing you're the stable, rational party here. The judge entered, a stern-looking man in his 60s named Harlan Stone. Graham knew him by reputation, fair but conservative, a stickler for propriety and traditional values. Not ideal for their case, but it could have been worse. All rise for the Honorable Judge Stone, the bailiff intoned. The hearing began with Vellum's lawyer laying out their case. Pritchard was smooth, painting a picture of a desperate widow who'd fallen into an inappropriate relationship with a wealthy rancher, sacrificing her children's welfare for her own comfort. He cited the removal from public school, the isolation from the community, the questionable moral environment. These children deserve better, Pritchard concluded. They deserve a stable home with proper supervision. Mr. Vellum, as the family's creditor and a concerned member of this community, is prepared to provide that home. He's arranged for the children to be placed with respectable families who will ensure they receive proper education and moral guidance. Elena's hand found Graham's under the table, squeezing so hard it hurt. Separate families. Just as Lydia had feared. Vellum wasn't planning to keep them together. He was going to scatter them like seeds, destroying their family unit entirely. Then it was Webb's turn. He stood slowly, his demeanor calm and confident. Your Honor, the plaintiff would have you believe this is a case about child welfare. It's not. This is a case about revenge, about a powerful man who's been denied something he wanted and is now using the legal system to punish those who defied him. Pritchard started to object, but Judge Stone waved him down. I'll allow it. Continue, Mr. Webb. Webb called his first witness, Doc Matthews. The doctor testified about Elena's condition when she'd first arrived at the Calder Ranch, painting a vivid picture of a woman and children on the verge of death. He spoke about their recovery, about the excellent care they'd received, about how Ruth's life had been saved by Graham's quick action. In your professional opinion, doctor, are these children being well cared for? Webb asked. Exceptionally well cared for, Doc Matthews replied firmly. They're healthy, well-fed, receiving education from a qualified tutor. They're thriving in ways I rarely see, even in traditional family settings. Next came Miguel, who testified about the children's integration into ranch life. Those boys, they work hard, but they laugh more, he said in his accented English. I see them learning, growing. They got light in their eyes now. When they first came, they looked like scared rabbits. Now they look like children should look, happy. Harold Thompson testified about Vellum's pressure tactics, about being told to refuse service to Elena and the children. Didn't sit right with me, he said. Felt like bullying, plain and simple. Then came the women, 5 of them, each taking the stand to tell their stories. A widow who'd been pressured to sign over her property. A farmer's wife whose husband's debt had been used to extort sexual favors. A young mother threatened with losing her home unless she agreed to Vellum's demands. Each story was different in details but identical in theme. Vellum used debt as a weapon, targeting vulnerable women without mercy. Pritchard tried to discredit them, suggesting they were lying, coordinating their stories. But the sheer number of similar accounts, combined with supporting documentation Webb had gathered, made dismissing them impossible. By midday, the momentum had shifted. Judge Stone's expression had grown increasingly troubled as witness after witness painted Vellum not as a concerned citizen, but as a predator. Finally, Webb called Elena to the stand. She walked to the witness box with her head high, refusing to be cowed by the dozens of eyes watching her. Webb took her through her story methodically. Her husband's death, the mounting debts, Vellum's proposition, her decision to run rather than submit. "And when you came to Mr. Calder's ranch?" Webb prompted. "We were dying," Elena said simply. "I'd given my children everything I had, every scrap of food, every drop of water. I knew I wouldn't last another day. I knocked on his door expecting, I don't know what I expected. Maybe that he'd take the children and leave me to die. But he didn't. He took all of us. He gave us shelter, food, safety. He gave us back our lives. And has he ever, at any time, behaved inappropriately toward you or your children? Never." Elena's voice rang with conviction. "He's been nothing but honorable. He hired me as his housekeeper, gave me honest work and fair pay. He arranged for a tutor when the town refused to school my children. He's protected us from Mr. Vellum's harassment. He's been," her voice caught, "he's been the best man I've ever known." Pritchard's cross-examination was brutal. He hammered at the propriety issue, at the appearance of sin regardless of actual behavior. He suggested that Elena had seduced Graham, using her children as leverage to secure his protection and resources. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Ward, that you're living quite comfortably at Mr. Calder's expense? That you've gone from destitute widow to pampered housekeeper in a matter of weeks?" Elena's eyes flashed. "Pampered?" "Sir, I work from dawn to dusk, cooking, cleaning, and caring for my children. I earn every penny Mr. Calder pays me. And as for comfort, yes, we're more comfortable than we were starving on the streets. If that's a crime, then I'm guilty as charged." "But you must admit the arrangement is irregular. The arrangement is a widow working for a widower. If that's irregular, then half the households in Texas are scandalous." Despite Pritchard's attempts to rattle her, Elena held firm. She was magnificent, strong but not aggressive, honest but not defensive. Graham watched her and felt his chest swell with pride and something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to love. When Elena stepped down, Webb called his final witness, Graham himself. Walking to the stand felt like walking through molasses, every eye in the courtroom tracking his movement. He settled into the chair and met Judge Stone's gaze directly. Webb kept his questions simple, focusing on Graham's character, his motivations, his vision for the future. Why had he taken the family in? What were his intentions toward Elena? How did he envision their living arrangement continuing? "I took them in because it was the right thing to do," Graham said. "Because I remembered what it was like to be hungry and scared and certain the world had forgotten you existed. Because I had the means to help and couldn't live with myself if I didn't." "And your intentions toward Mrs. Ward?" Graham's eyes found Elena in the courtroom. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, hope and fear and something else, something that made his heart race. "Honorable," he said finally. "My intentions are entirely honorable." Pritchard's cross-examination was predictable. Insinuations about impropriety, questions about whether Graham expected Elena's gratitude to manifest in physical ways, suggestions that he was using his wealth and position to essentially purchase a ready-made family. "Mr. Calder, isn't it true that you've been lonely since your wife's death? That you see Mrs. Ward and her children as replacements for the family you lost?" The question hit closer to home than Graham wanted to admit. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I have been lonely. And yes, Having Elena and her children in my home has made it feel less empty, but they're not replacements. They're their own people with their own value. I don't want them because they fill a void. I want them because they're worth wanting, because they've made my life better in ways I didn't know I needed. And yet, you maintain this is purely an employer-employee relationship? Graham met Pritchard's smug expression without flinching. It started that way. Whether it remains that way is between Mrs. Ward and myself, and nobody else's business. Judge Stone rapped his gavel. Mr. Pritchard, unless you have relevant questions about the children's welfare, move on. No further questions, Your Honor. The hearing concluded with closing arguments. Pritchard hammered home the impropriety angle, arguing that regardless of actual behavior, the children were being raised in an environment that defied social norms and moral standards. Webb countered by pointing out that social norms had nearly killed these children, that moral standards meant nothing if they resulted in dead babies and traumatized families. Your Honor, Webb concluded, this case is simple. On one side, you have a mother who's fought like hell to keep her children alive, and a man who's provided them safety and stability. On the other, you have a vindictive creditor using the law as a weapon to punish those who defied him. The choice should be obvious. Judge Stone called a recess to consider his ruling. The wait was agonizing, 2 hours that felt like 2 years. Graham sat with Elena and the children in an anteroom, everyone too nervous to speak much. Lydia held Ruth while the twins pressed close to their mother. Sarah sat with them, quietly supportive. Finally, they were called back. The courtroom had filled even more. Word must have spread that a ruling was imminent. Graham took his seat at the defense table, Elena beside him, and tried to prepare himself for whatever was coming. Judge Stone entered, his expression unreadable. He settled into his chair and shuffled papers for a moment that stretched into eternity. Then he looked up. This has been one of the more unusual cases I've presided over, he began. The law on such matters is complex, balancing parental rights against child welfare, social standards against individual circumstances. I've listened carefully to all testimony and reviewed all evidence presented. Graham felt Elena's hand find his under the table. Mr. Vellum's concerns about propriety are not without merit, Judge Stone continued, and Graham's heart sank. The living arrangement described does defy conventional standards. However, propriety must be weighed against practical reality. These children were literally dying when they came to Mr. Calder's ranch. By all accounts, they're now thriving. Well-fed, well-educated, well-cared for. To remove them from that environment based solely on social convention would be, in my judgment, a grave injustice. Hope flickered in Graham's chest. Furthermore, the judge said, his voice hardening, I find Mr. Vellum's motivations highly suspect. The testimony regarding his treatment of other debtors paints a disturbing picture. While I cannot make criminal judgments in this civil proceeding, I strongly encourage the county prosecutor to investigate these allegations further. Vellum's face had gone purple with rage. As to the custody petition itself, I find it without merit. Mrs. Ward has demonstrated herself to be a capable and devoted mother. Her children are clearly well-adjusted and happy. The living arrangement, while unconventional, appears to be working well for all parties involved. Judge Stone paused, his gaze moving between Graham and Elena. However, I would be remiss not to note that this arrangement cannot continue indefinitely without addressing the propriety concerns. I will not remove the children now, but I expect this situation to be formalized within a reasonable time frame. Let's say 6 months. He rapped his gavel. Petition denied. The children remain with their mother. This court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in noise, gasps, whispers, a few scattered cheers from Graham's supporters. But Graham heard none of it. He was too focused on Elena, who had collapsed against him, sobbing with relief. We won, she gasped. Oh God, we won. Lydia and the twins rushed forward, wrapping their arms around both of them. Sarah was crying. Miguel, who'd somehow made it into the courtroom, was grinning broadly. Even Marcus Webb looked pleased, which Graham suspected was rare for him. They'd won. The children were safe. The family stayed together. But as the celebration swirled around him, Graham's mind fixed on Judge Stone's final words. formalized within 6 months. The judge had essentially given them an ultimatum: legitimize the arrangement through marriage or face renewed scrutiny. Graham looked down at Elena, still clutching him like he was the only solid thing in a tilting world, and realized the judge had simply made explicit what had been growing between them for weeks. This wasn't just about protection anymore. This wasn't obligation or convenience or even friendship. This was love. Messy, complicated, born from desperation and crisis. But love nonetheless. The question was whether Elena felt the same way, and whether she'd be willing to marry him not because a judge demanded it, but because she wanted to. They left the courthouse to find a crowd waiting, some supportive, some still judgmental, all curious. Vellum was nowhere to be seen, which Graham counted as a blessing. The man had been publicly humiliated, his reputation as a concerned citizen thoroughly shredded. He'd be dangerous now, wounded and vengeful. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today was for celebration. They returned to the ranch to find Miguel had organized a feast: beef, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden, even a cake that one of the ranch hands' wives had baked. The entire crew turned out to celebrate, filling the house and yard with noise and laughter and life. Graham watched it all from the porch, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and felt something settle in his chest. This was what a home should be. Not silent and empty, not a tomb for memories, but alive with people and possibility. Elena found him there as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. She stood beside him in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their children play with Miguel's kids in the yard. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for fighting for us, for refusing to give up. You did as much fighting as I did. Maybe. But you gave me a place to fight from, solid ground when I'd forgotten what that felt like." Elena turned to face him. "Graham, about what the judge said." "About formalizing the arrangement." Graham's heart rate picked up. "Elena, you don't have to, I want to." She took a breath, her eyes bright. "Not because the judge says so. Not because it's proper or convenient, but because these last weeks have shown me something I didn't think I'd ever have again. A partner. Someone who sees me as an equal, not a burden or a prize. Someone who fights beside me, not for me." "Elena, let me finish." Her smile was tremulous but real. "I know this started as charity, me knocking on your door, desperate and dying, but somewhere along the way it became something else, something real. And if you're willing, if you want this to be permanent, not just for show but for real, then so do I." Graham set down his whiskey glass with careful precision. "Elena Ward, are you proposing to me?" She laughed, the sound bright and free. "Maybe I am. Someone has to, and you looked like you might stand there overthinking it all night." I've been thinking about it since Ruth stopped breathing," Graham admitted. "Since I held her and you and realized I couldn't imagine my life without any of you in it. But I didn't want to pressure you. You've been through so much, needed time to heal and figure out what you wanted without someone else's expectations weighing on you. What I want is this." Elena gestured at the scene around them, the house, the land, the children playing, the life they'd built together. "What I want is you, if you'll have me." Graham pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "Elena Ward, I would be honored to have you, as my wife, my partner, my family, all of it." She kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Graham tasted salt on her lips, tears, but happy ones this time. When they finally pulled apart, he saw Lydia watching from the window, her face lit with joy. She'd been worried about their future, about where they'd go and whether they'd stay together. Now she knew. They were staying together, forever. The celebration continued late into the night, but eventually the guests departed, the children were put to bed, and Graham found himself alone in his study with a glass of whiskey and a mind full of plans. Tomorrow he'd ride into town and buy a ring. Next week he'd talk to the preacher about a wedding. They'd do it properly this time. No more questions about propriety, no more ammunition for people like Vellum. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Miguel entered, his hat in his hands. "Boss, got a minute?" "Of course." Miguel settled into the chair across from Graham's desk. "Heard about the engagement. About time, if you ask me." Those two have been circling each other like nervous horses for weeks. Graham smiled. That obvious? To anyone with eyes. Miguel's expression grew serious. But there's something you need to know. I had some of the boys watching Vellum's place after the hearing. He left town about an hour ago, headed east with two men I didn't recognize. Could be nothing, but you don't think it's nothing. No, boss, I don't. That man's not going to take this loss lying down. He's been publicly humiliated, lost face, had his reputation shredded. Men like that, they get dangerous when cornered. Graham nodded slowly. He'd been thinking the same thing. The victory in court was just one battle. The war with Horace Vellum was far from over. Double the guards on the property, he ordered, especially near the house and the creek. Tell the men to be alert for anything unusual. And Miguel, thank you for everything, for standing by us when it would have been easier to stay out of it. Miguel stood, settling his hat back on his head. You're a good man, boss. And that lady and those kids, they're good people. Wasn't even a choice. After Miguel left, Graham sat for a long time in the quiet of his study, thinking about the future. They'd won today, but at what cost? Vellum was still out there, still dangerous, still capable of causing harm. The judge's investigation might lead somewhere, but powerful men had a way of avoiding consequences. They'd have to stay vigilant, stay together, stay strong. But for the first time in 3 years, Graham had something worth fighting for. Not just land or cattle or money, but family. Love. A future that held more than just empty rooms and painful memories. He finished his whiskey and climbed the stairs to his bedroom. Passing Elena's room, he heard her soft voice singing a lullaby to Ruth. The sound wrapped around him like a warm blanket, and Graham smiled. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Vellum would plot his revenge. The town would continue to gossip. Life would keep being complicated. But tonight, they were safe. They were together. They were home. And sometimes that was enough. Graham woke the next morning to find frost covering the windows. Unusual for early autumn in Texas, but the weather had turned sharp and cold overnight. He dressed quickly and went downstairs, already making mental notes about preparing for an early winter. The cattle would need extra feed. The barn repairs from the fire still weren't complete. There was always work to be done on a ranch, crisis or no crisis. But when he reached the kitchen, he found Elena already there, working on breakfast with a lightness in her movements he hadn't seen before. She hummed while she worked, and when she saw him, her smile was radiant. "Morning," she said, and there was something new in her voice, a joy that hadn't been there yesterday, before the hearing, before their conversation on the porch. "Morning." Graham moved to the coffee pot, pouring himself a cup. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months, maybe years." Elena cracked eggs into a pan, the sizzle filling the kitchen with comfortable domestic sounds. "I kept waking up thinking yesterday was a dream, that I'd open my eyes and we'd be back in that boarding house, or worse. But then I'd hear Ruth breathing beside me or the house settling around us, and I'd remember, this is real. We're really safe." Graham came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. The gesture felt natural now, right in a way nothing had felt right in years. It's real. All of it. They stood like that for a moment, just breathing together, before the sound of small feet on the stairs announced the children's arrival. Graham stepped back, and Elena shot him a smile that promised more moments like this in the future. Quiet, intimate, theirs. Breakfast was chaotic in the best way. The twins argued over who got more bacon while Lydia tried to maintain order like a miniature adult. Ruth gurgled contentedly in her basket, waving tiny fists at nothing in particular. Sarah joined them, looking more relaxed than Graham had seen her since the custody hearing was announced. "So," Sarah said, buttering her toast with studied casualness, "I heard a rumor that congratulations might be in order." Elena blushed, and Lydia's head snapped up. "What kind of congratulations?" Graham and Elena exchanged glances. They hadn't discussed when to tell the children, but there was no point in waiting. This affected them as much as anyone. "The kind where your mother and I are getting married," Graham said simply. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Lydia shrieked with delight. The twins whooped and high-fived each other, and even Ruth seemed to sense the excitement, squealing along with her siblings. They bombarded Graham and Elena with questions. When? Where? Could they be in the wedding? What would they wear? Would this mean Mr. Calder was their father now? Slow down, Elena laughed, but her eyes were wet. One question at a time. When? Lydia demanded. Please say soon. Please say you're not going to make us wait forever. Graham looked at Elena, raising an eyebrow in question. They hadn't discussed timing either. Elena bit her lip, thinking, then smiled. A month? Is that too soon? A month sounds perfect, Graham agreed. A month would give them time to plan properly, but not so long that doubt or fear could creep back in. Not so long that Vellum could orchestrate another attack. The thought of Vellum sobered him slightly. Miguel's warning from last night still echoed in his mind. The man had left town with unknown associates, and men like Horace Vellum didn't accept defeat gracefully. They'd won in court, but Graham had been in enough fights to know that victories could be temporary if you didn't stay vigilant. After breakfast, while Elena started planning the wedding with Lydia and Sarah, Graham rode out to check on his men. The increased guards were in place, watching the property's perimeter and the water sources with careful attention. Everything seemed quiet, almost too quiet, but Graham forced himself not to see threats in every shadow. He found Miguel near the creek, supervising a group of hands as they reinforced the banks and cleared debris. The foreman looked up at Graham's approach, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold morning air. All quiet, boss. No sign of Vellum or his men. Keep watching anyway. That man's not done with us. Agreed. Miguel paused, then grinned. Heard you're getting married. About damn time. Seems to be the consensus. Graham dismounted, walking along the creek bank. The water flowed clear and strong, life-giving and essential. It was what Vellum had tried to take from him, and Graham had fought back. But was fighting enough? How long could they live under the constant threat of retaliation? As if summoning trouble by thinking about it, one of the younger hands came galloping up, his horse lathered and his face tight with urgency. Mr. Calder! Miguel! You need to see this! They followed him to the eastern boundary of Graham's property, where the land transitioned from grassland to scrub brush. There, hammered into the ground, was a surveyor's stake with fresh markings, and beyond it, more stakes, creating a line that cut directly across what had been Graham's grazing land for years. What the hell is this? Graham demanded, dismounting to examine the stakes more closely. Found them this morning, the young hand said. Looks like someone's been out here surveying, drawing new property lines. Miguel's jaw tightened. Vellum. Has to be. Graham pulled up one of the stakes, examining the markings. They were official-looking, complete with county seal impressions. He's claiming this land isn't mine, trying to redraw boundaries to cut into my property. Can he do that? Not legally. My property lines are documented going back 30 years, but he can make it complicated. File disputes, tie me up in court, cause enough confusion that other ranchers start wondering if their boundaries are secure. Graham looked at the line of stakes stretching across his land and felt rage building. This is how he retaliates. Can't win in custody court, so he goes after my livelihood instead. They spent the rest of the morning pulling up stakes and documenting their locations. Graham sent one of his men to town to fetch his property deeds and survey records from the bank. If Vellum wanted a legal fight over boundaries, Graham would give him one, but this time with ironclad documentation. He returned to the house that afternoon to find a different kind of commotion. A wagon was parked in front, and Elena was standing on the porch arguing with a portly man in an expensive suit. Sarah stood beside her, arms crossed, looking ready to physically eject the visitor if necessary. "What's going on?" Graham asked, dismounting. The man turned, his expression oozing false friendliness. "Mr. Calder, perfect timing. I'm Chester Willoughby, county tax assessor. I'm here to conduct a routine inspection of your property." Routine. Graham's voice was flat. "I had my property assessed 6 months ago." "Yes, well, there have been some questions raised about potential improvements and changes to the property that might affect your tax liability. New structures, additional residents, that sort of thing." Willoughby smiled unctuously. "I'm sure it's all in order, but we need to verify for the county records." Elena caught Graham's eye, her expression saying clearly, "This is Vellum's doing." "You have paperwork authorizing this inspection?" Graham asked. Graham, Of course. Willoughby produced documents from his case, waving them vaguely. "All proper and legal. Now, if you'll just show me around, No. Graham's voice was hard. You can come back with the sheriff present and my lawyer. If this is a legitimate county inspection, you won't mind witnesses. Willoughby's smile slipped. Mr. Calder, I'm trying to be reasonable. So am I. You show up unannounced, claiming routine business that's anything but routine, and expect me to just let you wander my property? No. You want to inspect, we do it properly, with documentation and oversight. I could cite you for obstruction. Go ahead. Graham crossed his arms. But you'll have a hell of a time explaining to a judge why you needed immediate access without proper notice. Now get off my property before I have you removed for trespassing. Willoughby sputtered protests, but eventually climbed back into his wagon and left, throwing dark looks over his shoulder. As soon as he was gone, Elena sagged against the porch railing. How many more attacks? She asked quietly. Property lines, tax assessments. What's next? Whatever he can think of. Graham climbed the steps and took her hands. Vellum's trying to overwhelm us. Death by 1,000 cuts. Make us too tired and broke to keep fighting. Is it working? Graham looked at her, this woman who'd survived so much, who'd fought so hard for her children, who stood beside him now ready to face whatever came next. Not even close. He can throw everything he has at us. We'll still be standing. But that night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, Graham had to admit to himself that he was worried. Vellum's attacks were escalating and diversifying. Property disputes, tax harassment. What would come next? Health inspections? Banking pressure? There were dozens of ways a powerful, vindictive man could make life difficult. The answer came 3 days later, and it was worse than Graham had imagined. He was in town picking up supplies when Sheriff Cooper approached, his expression grim. Graham, need to talk to you, officially. Graham's stomach dropped. What's happened? There's been an accusation against you. Cooper wouldn't meet his eyes. Woman named Martha Henley claims that you made unwanted advances toward her. Says it happened 2 weeks ago when she came to your ranch selling preserves. For a moment, Graham couldn't process the words. Then understanding hit like a physical blow. That's a lie. Martha Henley has never been to my ranch. I've never even spoken to the woman. I believe you, but she's filed a formal complaint and I have to investigate. You understand? Cooper finally looked at him, and Graham saw sympathy there. This has vellum written all over it. He's paying her to make accusations, trying to destroy your reputation. Can he do that? Just pay someone to lie? If he's careful, yeah. And if it's your word against hers, things get complicated. Cooper shifted uncomfortably. There's more. 2 other women have come forward with similar claims. Different dates, different circumstances, but all saying you behaved inappropriately. Graham felt the world tilting. This was brilliant in its viciousness. Vellum couldn't prove Graham was actually immoral, so he'd manufacture evidence. Pay women to lie, create a pattern of accusations that would destroy Graham's character, even if none of it could be proven in court. This is insane. Tom, you know me. I would never... I know. But my knowing doesn't matter if half the town starts believing these stories. Cooper looked miserable. I have to follow procedure. Interview witnesses, document statements, and Graham? This is going to get ugly. Real ugly. I'm sorry. Graham left the sheriff's office feeling like he'd been gut-punched. He sat in his wagon for a long moment, trying to think through the implications. False accusations. Multiple women willing to lie for money. Even if he was eventually cleared, the damage would be done. Elena would be seen as a fool for marrying a man accused of such things. The children would hear whispers. The ranch would suffer as business associates distance themselves. Vellum had found his perfect weapon. Graham drove home slowly, dreading the conversation he'd have to have with Elena. How did you tell the woman you loved that you'd been accused of the very things she'd fled from in other men? How did you ask her to trust you when the world was screaming that you were untrustworthy? He found her in the garden with Ruth, enjoying the autumn sunshine while the baby played on a blanket. Elena looked up at his approach, and her smile faded immediately. What's wrong? Graham told her everything. With each word, he watched Elena's face grow paler, her expression more distressed. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, staring down at Ruth. Do you believe the accusations? Graham asked quietly. He needed to hear her say it. Elena's head snapped up. Of course not, Graham. I know you. I've seen how you are with people, with me, with my children. You're not capable of what they're claiming. Others won't be so certain. There will be talk. Worse than before. They'll say I'm exactly the kind of man who'd take advantage of desperate women. He swallowed hard. They'll say you were foolish to trust me, that you're putting your children at risk. Let them say it. Elena's voice was fierce. I don't care what they think. I know the truth. Elena, this could destroy us. Destroy everything we've built. Then we'll build it again. Somewhere else if we have to. She stood, crossing to him and gripping his arms. Graham called her. Listen to me. I've been broken before. I've lost everything and survived. What I won't survive is losing you because we were too afraid to fight. Vellum wants us scared and separated. He wants us to give up. I refuse. Graham pulled her close, holding her like she might disappear. I don't know how to fight this. How do you prove you didn't do something? How do you fight lies? The same way we fought the custody case. With truth. With witnesses. With people who know your character and will testify to it. Elena pulled back, her eyes blazing. And if that doesn't work, we do what you said before. We leave. Go somewhere he can't reach us. Start over. But we do it together. Over the next week, the accusations spread through Sweetwater like wildfire. Graham watched his reputation crumble in real time. Business associates suddenly became too busy to meet with him. Suppliers delayed orders. Even some of his ranch hands looked at him with new uncertainty, wondering if the accusations might have merit. The wedding planning ground to a halt. The preacher who'd agreed to perform the ceremony sent a polite note saying he couldn't in good conscience proceed until the accusations were resolved. Elena's fragile acceptance in town evaporated completely. Stores that had grudgingly served her now refused outright, and she received threatening letters telling her to leave Sweetwater before something bad happened to her or her children. Through it all, Marcus Webb worked tirelessly to build a defense. He interviewed Graham's staff, documented his whereabouts during the times of the alleged incidents, and investigated the accusers' backgrounds. What he found was damning. 2 of the 3 women had recently come into unexpected money, deposited into their bank accounts from an anonymous source. The 3rd woman, Martha Henley, had been seen meeting with one of Vellum's associates just days before making her accusation. It's circumstantial, Webb admitted, spreading papers across Graham's desk. But it's enough to establish reasonable doubt. The problem is, even if we can prove the accusations are false, the damage is done. Your reputation is shot. Elena's position is worse than ever, and Vellum walks away clean because we can't definitively prove he orchestrated it. So what do we do? Graham asked. That depends on what you're willing to sacrifice. Webb leaned back, studying Graham thoughtfully. Option 1. We fight this out in court. It'll take months, maybe years. Even if we win, the shadow of accusation never fully goes away. Option 2. You leave. Take Elena and the kids, sell the ranch, start somewhere fresh where Vellum's influence doesn't reach. Graham thought about the land he'd worked for years to build. The home that had been a tomb but was now alive with laughter and life. The crew of men who depended on him for their livelihoods. Walking away would mean abandoning all of it. But staying would mean subjecting Elena and the children to endless harassment and danger. There's a 3rd option, Elena said from the doorway. Neither man had heard her enter, but she stood there now with a determined expression that Graham recognized. We go on the offensive. Elena, Graham started. No, hear me out. She moved into the room, setting down a folder thick with papers. I've been doing research. Vellum's not just corrupt. He's gotten sloppy. He's been using his position on the county council to enrich himself for years, buying property below value after forcing sales through debt collection, taking kickbacks from contractors, even embezzling county funds. Webb sat up straighter. You can prove this? I've got documentation, records that some of the women I've been working with helped me access, ledgers that don't match official reports, property transfers that look suspicious. It's not perfect, but it's enough to warrant a formal investigation. If we go public with this, Vellum will know it came from you, Graham said. He'll retaliate. He's already retaliating. At least this way we're fighting back instead of just defending. Elena's jaw was set. I'm tired of being his victim. I'm tired of watching him hurt people and getting away with it because everyone's too scared to stand up to him. It ends now." The decision was made. Webb would take Elena's evidence to the territorial prosecutor in Austin, bypassing local corruption entirely. Simultaneously, Graham would contact the journalist he'd corresponded with earlier, providing the full story, not just about Vellum's harassment of Elena, but about his years of corruption, the false accusations, the systematic abuse of power. It was risky. If they failed, Vellum would crush them. But if they succeeded, they'd free not just themselves, but every person living under his shadow of fear. The article ran 3 weeks later in the Austin newspaper, picked up by papers across Texas. The headline read, "County Councilman's Reign of Terror, How One Man Used Debt and Power to Control a Texas Town." The journalist had done thorough work, interviewing multiple sources and uncovering even more evidence of Vellum's corruption than Elena had found. The response was immediate and explosive. The territorial prosecutor announced a formal investigation. The county council suspended Vellum pending the outcome. Several of his business associates distanced themselves publicly, claiming they'd had no knowledge of his activities. And most satisfying of all, the 3 women who'd accused Graham recanted their statements, admitting they'd been paid to lie. But Vellum himself remained silent. He'd disappeared from Sweetwater the day the article was published, and no one seemed to know where he'd gone. Graham tried to feel relief, but he couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't over. Wounded predators were the most dangerous kind. The feeling proved prophetic. 4 nights after the article ran, Graham woke to the smell of smoke. He was on his feet instantly, his heart hammering. Smoke meant fire, and fire on a ranch meant disaster. He pulled on pants and boots, yelling for everyone to wake up as he ran for the stairs. Miguel was already pounding on the front door, shouting warnings. "The barn! The main barn's on fire!" Not again. Graham's mind flashed to the south barn burning weeks ago, but this was worse. The main barn housed their breeding stock, their most valuable horses, equipment they couldn't afford to lose twice. And worst of all, the hay stored there would burn like a torch, spreading flames to other structures if they weren't careful. "Get everyone out of the house," Graham shouted to Elena, who'd appeared at the top of the stairs with Ruth in her arms. "Take the children to the bunkhouse. Miguel, round up every able body. We're not losing this barn." The next hours were chaos. Men formed bucket lines while others worked to evacuate panicked animals. The fire was worse than the last one, clearly set with accelerant in multiple locations. Graham worked alongside his crew, his lungs burning from smoke, his hands blistering from hot metal as they fought to save what they could. They were so focused on the barn that they almost didn't notice the second fire. It was one of the younger hands who saw it, pointing toward the house with a shout of alarm. Flames were licking up the back wall of the main house near the kitchen. Someone had set a second fire while everyone was distracted by the barn. Graham's blood turned to ice. The children. Elena had taken them to the bunkhouse, but had they made it safely? Or had Vellum's men intercepted them? He ran toward the house, Miguel at his heels, fear giving him speed he didn't know he possessed. The kitchen was engulfed, flames spreading rapidly through the old wood structure. But through the smoke, Graham could hear something, a child screaming. "Lydia!" he yelled. "Where are you?" "Upstairs!" Her voice was faint, terrified. "We couldn't get down. The stairs are blocked." How was that possible? Elena was supposed to have gotten them out. Unless she'd gone back in for something, or someone had prevented them from leaving. Graham didn't waste time thinking. He grabbed a wet blanket from the bucket line, wrapped it around himself, and plunged into the burning building. The smoke was blinding, the heat intense enough to make his skin feel like it was blistering even through the blanket. He found the stairs. Lydia was right. They were blocked by fallen timbers, deliberately placed to trap anyone upstairs. This wasn't just arson. This was attempted murder. "Lydia, can you get to a window?" "The window's stuck. Mama's trying to open it, but it won't move." Graham changed course, running back outside and around to the side of the house. The second-story windows were too high to reach normally, but there was a trellis Sarah had been training roses on. It wouldn't hold his weight, but maybe. He found a ladder in the chaos, dragging it to the wall and propping it up. It was too short by several feet, but combined with the trellis, he might make it. Graham climbed with reckless speed, feeling the ladder shift beneath him, hearing the trellis crack under his grip. But he pushed upward. driven by the terror of losing this family he'd only just found. His hand caught the windowsill. Through the smoke-stained glass, he could see Elena struggling with the window latch while the twins huddled behind her and Lydia held Ruth. The baby was crying, her face red with the effort. Graham smashed the window with his elbow, ignoring the bite of glass, and reached inside to help Elena with the latch. Together they forced it open and fresh air rushed in, feeding the flames somewhere inside the room. "Lydia first," Elena said, her voice hoarse with smoke. "Take her. All of you, now. The house is coming down." They worked with desperate efficiency. Lydia climbed out first, Graham guiding her to the trellis and teaching her how to climb down. The twins went next, more sure-footed than he'd expected, motivated by terror into bravery. Then Elena, passing Ruth through the window first before climbing out herself. Graham was about to follow when he heard it, a voice from deeper in the house calling for help. Sarah. They'd forgotten about Sarah. "Get down!" he yelled to Elena. "I'll get her." He climbed back through the window into the inferno. The smoke was so thick now he could barely see, barely breathe. He dropped to his hands and knees, remembering that air was cleaner near the floor, and crawled toward the sound of Sarah's voice. He found her in her bedroom, trapped behind a door that had warped from the heat and wouldn't open. Graham threw his shoulder against it once, twice, 3 times before the wood gave way. Sarah fell into his arms, coughing violently. "Can you walk?" "I think so." "Then we run. Now." They stumbled through the smoke together, Graham half carrying Sarah as they navigated by memory and desperate instinct. The stairs were fully engulfed now. No way down that route. They'd have to use the window. But when they reached the room, they found their exit blocked. The trellis had given way completely, and the ladder had fallen or been moved. They were trapped on the second floor of a burning building with no clear way down. Graham looked around wildly. The roof. If they could reach the roof, maybe they could jump to the lower section over the porch. It was risky as hell, but staying here meant certain death. He smashed out another window, this one leading to the sloped roof above the parlor. "Come on!" They climbed out into cold night air that felt like a blessing after the heat inside. The roof tiles were slick, the angles steep. Graham held Sarah's hand as they edged along, hearing the house groan and shift behind them as fire consumed its structure. Below, he could see his crew still fighting the barn fire, unaware of the drama playing out above them. Elena stood with the children near the bunkhouse, her face turned upward, watching. Even from this distance, Graham could see her terror. They reached the edge of the roof above the porch. It was still a 10-foot drop to the ground, enough to break bones if done wrong, but the alternative was burning alive. "We jump on 3, Graham said. "Together. Try to roll when you hit." "Graham." No time to argue. 1, 2, 3. They leaped, and for a moment Graham felt weightless, suspended between one life and another. Then the ground rushed up, and impact drove the air from his lungs. He rolled instinctively, feeling something in his shoulder crunch but not stopping until he'd cleared the danger zone. Sarah had landed beside him, groaning but conscious. Miguel was there instantly, helping them both up and pulling them away as part of the roof collapsed inward with a shower of sparks. Elena reached him seconds later, throwing her arms around him with such force they both nearly fell. She was crying and cursing him in equal measure, calling him an idiot and a hero and everything in between. "You could have died," she sobbed. "You could have died and left us and—" "But I didn't!" Graham held her tight, looking over her shoulder at his house, his home, burning to the ground. Years of memories, everything he'd built, reduced to ash. But his family was safe. Every person he cared about had made it out alive. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. The fires burned through the night. By dawn, both barns and most of the main house were destroyed. The damage was catastrophic, hundreds of thousands of dollars in losses, years of work reduced to smoking rubble. Graham stood in the gray morning light surveying the destruction and felt oddly calm. "Boss?" Miguel approached, his face grim and soot-stained. "Found something you need to see." He led Graham to the tree line beyond the house where the ground was disturbed. Footprints, boot marks, and most damning of all, a monogrammed handkerchief dropped in haste, marked with the initials HV Horace Vellum, had been here. Had probably set the fires himself, or watched while his hired men did. He'd tried to burn Graham out, and when that hadn't worked fast enough, he'd tried to murder the family inside. "That's enough evidence for the sheriff," Miguel said. "Hell, it's enough evidence for a lynch mob if you wanted." Graham stared at the handkerchief, feeling rage and exhaustion war inside him. He was so tired of fighting, so tired of looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next attack. How much more could they endure? But then he felt a small hand slip into his. Lydia, her face streaked with soot and tears, looking up at him with absolute trust. Behind her stood the twins, and Sarah holding Ruth, and Elena watching him with those fierce eyes that had first captivated him. His family. Battered but unbroken. Together. "We take this to the sheriff," Graham said quietly. "We do it legal and proper. No lynch mobs. No vigilante justice. We let the law handle it." Within hours, Sheriff Cooper had assembled a posse and ridden out in search of Vellum. They found him at his ranch house, drunk and defiant, surrounded by evidence of his crimes. The arrest was anticlimactic. No dramatic shootout or chase, just a broken man being led away in chains while his empire crumbled around him. The trial that followed was swift and merciless. Vellum's corruption was laid bare for all to see. The embezzlement, the extortion, the violence. Witness after witness testified to his crimes, and the evidence Elena had gathered proved instrumental in securing convictions on multiple counts. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, effectively a life sentence for a man his age. His assets were seized to pay restitution to his victims, including Elena. The debt that had started this whole nightmare was officially forgiven, and she received additional compensation for the harassment she'd endured. But the money meant little compared to the knowledge that Horace Vellum could never hurt anyone again. In the weeks following the trial, Graham and his crew worked to rebuild. The community, shamed by their role in ostracizing Elena and the children, rallied to help. Suddenly, everyone wanted to contribute to the rebuild, to show they'd been on the right side all along. Graham accepted their help with weary grace, too exhausted to hold grudges. The new house rose from the ashes of the old, bigger and brighter and built to last. They incorporated elements Elena suggested: a larger kitchen, more bedrooms, a library that made Lydia gasp with delight. It wasn't just Graham's house anymore. It was their house, their home. 6 weeks after Vellum's sentencing, on a crisp December morning, Graham Calder and Elena Ward were married in the parlor of their new house. The ceremony was small, just family and the closest friends who'd stood by them through everything. The preacher who'd refused before now officiated with embarrassed enthusiasm, and the town that had shunned them watched from a respectful distance, not invited, but not forbidden. Elena wore a simple cream dress that Sarah had sewn, with wildflowers in her hair despite the season. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the dress or flowers, and everything to do with the joy radiating from her face. When Graham took her hands and spoke his vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I promise to stand beside you, to fight for you, to build a life with you that's worthy of the courage you've shown. I promise to be a father to your children and a partner to you in good times and in hardship, until my last breath." Elena's vows were equally simple and equally profound. "I promise to never stop fighting, to never stop believing, to love you with everything I am, and build a future with you that honors everything we've survived. You saved my life. Let me spend the rest of it showing you what that gift means." When they kissed, the small crowd erupted in applause. The twins whooped. Lydia cried happy tears. Ruth, held in Sarah's arms, seemed to understand that something important was happening and gurgled contentedly. The reception was joyful and chaotic, filled with music and laughter and food that seemed to appear from everywhere. Miguel made a toast that had everyone laughing and crying. Doc Matthews pronounced them the stubbornest pair he'd ever met and predicted they'd have a long, argumentative marriage full of life. As the sun set and guests began to depart, Graham found himself on the porch with Elena, watching their children play in the yard. The twins were teaching some ranch hands' kids how to rope fence posts. Lydia sat under a tree reading to a group of younger children who'd been captivated by her storytelling. Ruth slept peacefully in her basket, finally strong and healthy and safe. "We did it," Elena said softly. "We actually survived." "We did more than survive." Graham pulled her close. We won, built something real, something good. Elena tilted her face up to his. I never thought I'd have this. A home, a husband who sees me as an equal, children who feel safe enough to be children again. It's more than I ever dreamed possible. Then we'll keep dreaming bigger. Graham kissed her forehead. Keep building, keep fighting when we need to and resting when we can. Together. Together, Elena echoed. 6 months later, as spring turned the grasslands green and wildflowers painted the hills in riots of color, Elena stood in that same spot and felt the life growing inside her, a child that was hers and Graham's both, a symbol of everything they'd built together. She'd told him that morning, watching his face transform from surprise to wonder to pure joy. Another one? He'd said, then laughed. Guess we're going to need an even bigger table. Now, watching Lydia help the twins with their lessons while Ruth toddled after them on increasingly steady legs, Elena felt peace settle into her bones. The journey had been brutal, the cost had been high. But standing here on this land, in this home, with this family they'd fought so hard to protect, she knew every moment of hardship had been worth it. Graham emerged from the barn, saw her watching, and smiled. That rare, full smile he saved for moments when he was genuinely happy. He crossed the yard and wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands coming to rest on her still flat stomach. Thinking? He asked. Remembering. That night I knocked on your door, so scared and desperate and certain we were all going to die. If someone had told me then that this was waiting for us, this life, this love, this family, I wouldn't have believed them. I wouldn't have believed it either. I was so lost, Elena. So empty. You didn't just save yourself by knocking on my door, you saved me too. She turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd become her husband, her partner, her home. Then I guess we saved each other. Best deal I ever made, Graham said, and kissed her while their children played and the Texas sun shone warm and bright on the life they'd built from ashes and courage and love. Years later, when their children and grandchildren asked them to tell the story of how they met, Graham and Elena would take turns recounting it. The storm, the desperate knock, the whispered plea, "Sir, please take my children." And Graham's response, the words that changed everything, "I'll take you too." It became family legend, told and retold, the foundation story of the Calder family. But the ending was always the same. Not the dramatic rescues or the courtroom victories or even the wedding, but the quiet truth that emerged from all of it. Sometimes they would say, the family you're born into isn't the one you're meant for. Sometimes you have to knock on a stranger's door in a storm and trust that the person who answers will see you not as a burden, but as a gift. Sometimes you have to be brave enough to say yes to people who need you, even when it's complicated and costly and might destroy everything you've built. Because in the end, what's the point of building anything if there's no one to share it with? The Calder Ranch thrived for generations, growing and prospering under the careful stewardship of Graham and Elena, and eventually their children. The story of its founding, of a starving mother and a lonely widower who chose courage over fear, love over isolation, became the bedrock of everything that came after. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the grass and the stars emerged one by one, you could almost hear it, the echo of that desperate knock, the ghost of that whispered plea, and the answer that changed everything. "Sir, please take my children. I'll take you too, forever."